The Giza Plateau, situated west of Memphis, held a special significance for Amenhotep II. It was here that he first learned the arts of archery and horseback riding. Near the Great Sphinx lay a practice course, making the area a favored site for royal sports and pastimes. One day, as Amenhotep galloped through the grand necropolis, he was struck with awe by the majestic pyramids of Khufu and Khafra, ancestors from a distant past. Moved by their immense size, grandeur, and age, the king resolved to immortalize his own accomplishments on a magnificent stela placed between the paws of the Great Sphinx. This monument combined lofty declarations with specific details of his sporting prowess, offering valuable insight into his character. In further tribute to the Sphinx, Amenhotep constructed a temple beside it, venerating the monument as the sun god Horus of the horizon. The temple quickly became a favored place of worship for other members of the royal family, including Amenhotep's son and successor, Thutmose IV. Thutmose IV took his devotion to the Sphinx even further. He declared Hormizd to be his personal protector, crediting the god for his rise to kingship. His own great stela, erected beside his father's, recounted how Hormizd appeared to him in a dream while he was still a prince, promising him the throne if he would clear away the sand engulfing the Sphinx. After ascending the throne of Horus, Thutmose fulfilled this divine request, completing the excavation and constructing an enclosure wall to safeguard the monument from future desert encroachment. Notably, his inscription makes no reference to Ammon-Ra, the state god so prominently honored in his father's stela, focusing instead on Hormizd. Under Thutmose's reign, this northern, solar deity became the chief source of royal legitimacy. Even at Ipit Sut, the sanctuary of Ammon-Ra, Thutmose had himself portrayed as a hybrid of man and celestial falcon, emphasizing his identification with the sun god. Through this deliberate imagery, he highlighted the divine solar aspects of kingship, moving away from the military image that had defined his predecessors. With peace established with Mitanni, Thutmose IV shifted his focus to domestic matters rather than military campaigns. Diplomacy replaced warfare as the primary tool of foreign policy. In Nubia, administration was reorganized with the appointment of a viceroy to oversee all Egyptian-controlled territories. In the north, Thutmose strengthened ties with Mitanni by marrying a Mitannian princess, sealing an alliance with a former adversary. Just 2 generations earlier, his ancestor Thutmose III had battled Mitanni for dominance in the Near East. Now, former enemies were bound by marriage. This peaceful environment allowed trade to flourish once more across the eastern Mediterranean, Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia, with caravans transporting luxury goods by both land and sea. Egypt, rich in gold, profited most from this trade boom, exchanging its precious metal for foreign metals, timber, gemstones, and other royal luxuries. The alliance with Mitanni also fueled a surge of new construction projects throughout Egypt and Nubia. These monuments prominently featured solar motifs, signaling a shift in royal ideology. With secure borders, peaceful neighbors, and a monarchy more resplendent than ever, Egypt stood poised for an expansion of kingship unrivaled since the era of the Great Pyramid. All Egyptian kings possessed a flair for self-promotion. For Amenhotep III, the 9th ruler of the 18th dynasty, 1390 to 1353, it must have been particularly challenging to suppress the grandiose impulses that came with kingship. Descended from conquerors and seated on a throne blessed by the sun, Amenhotep inherited from his father, Thutmose IV, a nation enjoying extraordinary wealth and rare stability. Egypt's dominance over the Near East had reached its peak. Peaceful relations had been established and solidified with other great powers, including Babylonia, Assyria, and Mitanni. Throughout his nearly 40-year reign, Amenhotep III enjoyed the unique distinction of being the only pharaoh of his dynasty who never waged war in Western Asia. His rule was instead marked by a flourishing of the arts and an extraordinary cultivation of his own divine persona. Amenhotep's cultivation of royal fame began early. Still a child when he ascended the throne, He experienced his first taste of royal spectacle just 2 years into his reign, in 1389. Likely a carefully staged event rather than a spontaneous act of courage, the young king participated in a wild bull hunt at Shetep, west of Memphis. To commemorate the event, the royal court issued a large glazed scarab. Distributed widely across Egypt and its vassal territories, it broadcasted the young monarch's feat both to his subjects and for future generations. A remarkable event occurred for His Majesty. A report reached him. There are wild bulls in the desert near Shetep. His Majesty sailed swiftly downstream and arrived peacefully at Shetep in the morning. Mounted on his chariot, with his full army following behind, His Majesty ordered a trench to be dug to trap the wild bulls. He then advanced against them. The herd numbered 170. On the first day, His Majesty hunted and captured 56 wild bulls. After resting his horses for 4 days, he resumed the hunt and captured 40 more. In total, 96 wild bulls were taken. The repetitive and ceremonial tone of the account seems almost offensive. Even for a youthful king nearing adolescence, it likely required little effort to slaughter bulls trapped in an enclosed space with no chance of escape. Yet this announcement established the tone for Amenhotep's reign. He was fulfilling one of the king's most ancient and sacred duties, maintaining order by subduing manifestations of chaos. Another commemorative scarab, issued during the 10th year of his reign, celebrated a similar feat, recording that the king had personally hunted and killed 110 lions during his first decade on the throne. After his youthful enthusiasm for blood sports to demonstrate his manhood, a transformation appears to have taken place in Amenhotep III as he matured. The following commemorative scarab, issued just a year later, celebrated not a hunting expedition, but a construction achievement. This was no simple ornamental pond. It was a rowing lake over a mile long and nearly a quarter mile wide. To inaugurate the lake, the king sailed across it in his royal barge, aptly named the Dazzling Orb. In both the nature of the project and its grand opening, Amenhotep seemed to have discovered his true passion. From this point forward, the kingdom echoed with the sounds of laborers digging, hammering, chiseling, and building. Amenhotep III would become Egypt's most prolific royal builder since the very foundation of the kingdom 15 centuries earlier, fulfilling his vision of creating monuments, the likes of which had never existed since the earliest times of the two lands. Many of these structures would also serve as stages for magnificent festivals and elaborate ceremonies, all centered on exalting the king himself. Evidence from 2 of Egypt's largest limestone quarries reveals that construction had already begun at the very start of Amenhotep III's reign. Reopening these quarries was his first recorded royal act. The pace of building accelerated dramatically during his second and third decades on the throne, eventually reaching an unprecedented scale. From the Nile Delta to Nubia, scarcely a temple existed that did not bear his influence. At Saqqara, he ordered the first tomb, chapel, and burial for the sacred Apis bull, revered as the incarnation of the Memphite creator god Ptah. On the island of Abu, he supervised the building of a new shrine dedicated to another creator god, Khnum. The greatest beneficiary of this royal patronage, however, was the supreme creator, the sun god Ra. In a carefully orchestrated religious program, Amenhotep and his theologians reinterpreted various national cults to emphasize their ties to solar worship. At Kmun, for example, colossal statues of baboons were erected at Thoth's temple. While sacred to Thoth, baboons were also associated with Ra because they heralded the sunrise with their cries. At Sumenu, modern El Rizakat, near Thebes, the local crocodile god Sobuk was transformed into Sobuk Ra, a hybrid deity, and honored with a grand new temple adorned with monumental art. In all his construction projects, Amenhotep carefully linked himself with solar divinities, adopting titles such as heir of Ra and Ra's chosen one. He sought to present himself as the living embodiment of solar power, creator and sustainer of life, bringer of fertility, and the fierce eye of Ra that, when provoked, unleashed its wrath upon Egypt's enemies to preserve cosmic order. Never before had divine kingship been so deeply intertwined with such sophisticated theological constructs. Among all the sites that witnessed Amenhotep's ambitious building campaigns, none experienced his full vision and energy quite like Thebes. From the moment he ascended the throne, the king adopted the title ruler of Thebes and swiftly moved to justify it through action as well as proclamation. Under his rule, the city dedicated to Nefertiti was transformed into Homer's famed 100-gated Thebes. Towering temple gateways dotted both sides of the Nile, creating a landscape dominated by monumental grandeur. At Ipit-Sut, the heart of Ammonius worship, Amenhotep commissioned a new grand entrance to the entire temple complex, while also adding another gateway on the southern axis leading to the sanctuary of the goddess Mut. The king lavishly adorned these structures with an extraordinary array of stone sculptures, including over 700 statues of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess tied to the blazing Eye of Ara, with 2 statues representing each day of the year. In the northern part of the Ipit-Sut precinct, he oversaw the reconstruction of an older temple dedicated to Montu, the son of Ammonius and Mut, and the creation of a new temple honoring Mut, the goddess of truth and justice. Every building was enriched with an astonishing quantity of fine sculpture. In fact, more statues of Amenhotep III survive than of any other pharaoh, a testament to the ceaseless productivity of his royal workshops. Yet, the king's projects at Ipit-Sut paled in comparison to his grandest undertaking in Thebes, his mortuary temple on the Nile's western bank. Initiated early in his reign and continually expanded in later stages, this temple would become the largest royal sanctuary ever built in ancient Egypt. Though only the column bases remain today, due to later rulers repurposing its stones, the original temple was an unparalleled marvel. Spanning 93 acres, it surpassed even the great temple of Ammonius Ra in scale and magnificence, overflowing with colossal statues. Within one of its courtyards stood immense statues of Amenhotep III as Osiris, towering over 26 feet tall. Another court featured a seated double statue of the king and his queen, tied with fragments of 2 even larger colossi discovered nearby. The temple's northern entrance was flanked by gigantic granite statues of the king striding forward, while vast processional avenues lined with enormous sphinxes and jackals connected its 3 grand courtyards. Each court featured monumental gateways, guarded by further colossal seated figures of Amenhotep. The most imposing pair, still standing today and known as the Colossi of Memnon, rise over 60 feet high, accompanied by smaller statues of his mother, wife, and daughter. Visible for miles, these towering monuments projected Amenhotep's supreme authority, inspiring awe and reverence in all who beheld them. Beyond their imposing presence, these massive statues carried a deeper, symbolic meaning. Each year, after being partially submerged by the Nile's floods for several months, they would reappear as symbols of rebirth, perfectly expressing the rejuvenating purpose of Amenhotep's mortuary temple, his eternal mansion of millions of years. Many of the temple's divine statues were carved from granodiorite, their black color signifying rebirth, while statues of the king were often made from red granite or golden quartzite, their solar hues reinforcing his close association with Tish, the sun god. Everywhere throughout this vast complex, the themes of creation and rebirth echoed, presenting the king as the vital center of the universe. Up to this point, Amenhotep's reign had dramatically elevated the prestige of kingship and his own divine status. Yet even greater achievements still lay ahead. While Amenhotep, the ruler of rulers, was transforming Thebes and elevating both the monarchy and his personal glory, his envoys worked tirelessly to spread his fame and secure his influence across distant lands. Traveling throughout the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean, these emissaries negotiated treaties and secured advantageous trade deals, ensuring Egypt remained a dominant force and advancing their king's imperial ambitions. One of the most fascinating aspects of Amenhotep's foreign policy is revealed through a set of place names inscribed on statue bases found at his mortuary temple. The hieroglyphic system, ill-suited to foreign languages, rendered these names an awkward and initially puzzling combinations. I am New York Shah, Katunawai, Khan USH, MUKINU. Upon closer examination, these inscriptions turn out to list key centers of the 14th century BC Greek world. Amnisos, Kydonia, Knossos, and Mycenae, along with Phaistos, Lyctos, Nauplian, Boeotian Thebes, the island of Kythera, and possibly even Ilios, Homer's Troy. The sequence of names suggests the route taken by an Egyptian diplomatic mission dispatched to engage the leading city-states of the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds. Such an initiative made perfect sense. Mycenaean trade networks supplied Egypt with valuable cobalt used to produce deep blue glass, while lead for opaque and white glass was imported from Greece's Laurion Peninsula, part of Mycenae's territory. Despite Egypt's traditional mistrust of foreigners, it could not afford to ignore this rising economic power in the Aegean. Closer to Egypt's own borders, diplomacy remained crucial for maintaining control over its Near Eastern conquests. A groundbreaking discovery made in 1887 shed light on the intricate relationships between Egypt, its vassals, and rival powers. The Amarna letters consist of 380 clay tablets written in cuneiform, using the Babylonian language, the diplomatic tongue of the Bronze Age. Many of these letters date from Amenhotep III's later years, sent by subordinate rulers who dutifully addressed the pharaoh as "my son, my lord." Unlike Nubia, where Egypt imposed its own administrative system through appointed officials, its territories in the Near East retained local rulers who pledged loyalty to the pharaoh and paid regular tribute. Still, the humiliation of foreign domination bred resentment, and many vassals spent their time conspiring against one another, often trying to manipulate Egypt's position against rival powers like the Mitanni and the Hittites. The Amarna letters reveal a highly unstable political landscape, characterized by bitter rivalries and frequent skirmishes between city-states. In Palestine, troublesome vassals such as Milkalu of Gezer, Biridia of Megiddo, and Abdi-Heba of Jerusalem stirred constant unrest. Generally, Egypt avoided entangling itself in these minor disputes unless its economic interests were jeopardized. More serious challenges arose further north, where instability threatened the delicate balance of power between Egypt and the Hittites. A significant portion of the Amarna archive consists of pleas from Ribada of Kebni, a city long allied with Egypt. Ribada grew increasingly wary of his neighbor, the state of Amurru, ruled by the ambitious Abdi-Ashurta. His suspicions proved justified. As Amurru advanced, it seized Sumer, modern Al-Hamidiyya, Egypt's garrison town and administrative hub, and virtually besieged Kebni. This upheaval provided the Hittites with a perfect pretext to intervene, ultimately resulting in Amurru's defection from Egyptian control. The episode served as a stark reminder of how local disputes could quickly escalate, undermining Egypt's authority and jeopardizing its imperial stability. Whereas Thutmose III and Amenhotep II would not have hesitated to launch military campaigns, Amenhotep III adopted a distinctly different approach. His primary aim was to exploit his foreign territories economically and maintain political control with minimal deployment of Egyptian troops. To achieve this, Egyptian garrisons were stationed at key coastal ports such as Gaza, Jaffa, Al-Azza, and Sumer, as well as at strategic inland locations like Beth Shan at the eastern end of the Jezreel Valley and Qumidi in the Bekaa Valley. Fortified grain storage facilities along the coastline stood ready to serve as supply centers if military action became necessary. Administrative headquarters led by Egyptian governors in Gaza, Qumidi, and Sumer completed the system of colonial governance. This structure proved largely effective, and the loyalty of subordinate rulers was further secured through the regular distribution of valuable ornaments produced by the royal workshops, somewhat comparable to how the British Empire awarded honors to Indian princes. When it came to dealing with other major powers, however, mere gifts were insufficient. Though the pharaoh was regarded by his people as ruler of the universe, in reality, he shared the international stage with 6 other Near Eastern sovereigns. In Mesopotamia, these included the kings of Babylonia, Assyria, and Mitanni. In Anatolia, the rulers of the Hittites and Arzawa, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, the king of Alatia, Cyprus. This exclusive circle referred to one another as brother, and their correspondence often revealed petty rivalries when demands went unmet. Among the Amarna letters, roughly 3 dozen communications from these great powers to Amenhotep III center around customary diplomatic exchanges. A typical letter from King Tushratta of Mitanni exemplifies the tone. For me, everything goes well. May all be well for you, for your household, your wives, your sons, your nobles, your warriors, your horses, your chariots, and throughout your country. Yet there was another recurring theme: Egypt's legendary wealth. Tushratta expressed it directly. May my brother send me unworked gold in vast quantities, far more than was sent to my father. In your land, gold is as abundant as dust. Gold served as the main currency of diplomatic exchange, and Egypt's rich Nubian mines granted it significant leverage. It is no surprise, then, that a rebellion in Nubia's gold-mining region during the 30th year of Amenhotep III's reign was swiftly and harshly crushed. Without its gold, Egypt's international power would have been severely weakened. In exchange for these regular gold shipments, Amenhotep III sought to obtain something even more valuable: royal daughters as diplomatic brides. Early in his reign, he succeeded in marrying a Mitannian princess, and a commemorative scarab from 1381 records the arrival of Princess Gelukapa, accompanied by 317 female attendants, described simply as marvels. 25 years later, Amenhotep pursued a second Mitannian marriage, both to reaffirm ties with the new king of Mitanni and, perhaps, because Gelukapa had aged. The negotiations for this new alliance involved intricate exchanges of gifts. Eventually, King Tushratta agreed to send his daughter Tadukapa, along with a retinue of 270 women and 30 men, plus a massive dowry of 44 pounds of gold and an additional 13 pounds as a personal gift to Amenhotep himself. Though one might view this as excessive, the pharaoh was clearly pleased, and the alliance was secured. The Babylonians, however, proved less accommodating. Amenhotep had already married one Babylonian princess earlier in his reign, but when he sought another union with a new Babylonian king, Kadashman-Enlil I, he encountered resistance. Kadashman-Enlil complained that no one had seen his sister since she entered Amenhotep's harem more than a decade earlier, making him hesitant to send another daughter into what seemed an uncertain fate. He also expressed offense at not being invited to Amenhotep's recent major festival. Further, he raised concerns about how foreign brides were treated at the Egyptian court. My daughters who have married neighboring kings still communicate with my messengers and send me gifts, but the one with you is neglected. To compound matters, Kadashman-Enlil proposed a reciprocal marriage arrangement. Amenhotep flatly refused, asserting that no Egyptian princess had ever been given in marriage to a foreigner and that he had no intention of breaking this precedent merely to please the Babylonian king. As a result, the prospects for another Babylonian marriage initially seemed bleak. In the end, though Egypt's wealth once again tipped the scales, and Amenhotep secured the alliance he desired. The Amarna letters record one additional marriage negotiation, this time between Amenhotep and King Tarkaradu of Arzawa. Though the correspondence does not reveal the outcome, it is likely that the negotiations were successful. Amenhotep III was not known for accepting failure. As Pharaoh approached his first jubilee, marking 30 years of rule, his campaign of self-glorification entered a new stage. Since ancient times, the climax of a king's jubilee celebrations had been the said festival. For Amenhotep III, the idea of renewal held particular importance, and he resolved to approach it with a thoroughness surpassing all his predecessors. He envisioned not a single ceremonial event, but, in keeping with his grand ambitions, a monumental structure and a lasting display of royal statuary to secure his eternal rebirth. The site chosen for this immense project lay on the east bank of the Nile, roughly 3 miles south of Sut, directly opposite his mortuary temple. Today, it forms the heart of modern Luxor. At the start of his reign, the area was virtually undeveloped, containing only a modest shrine from the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, originally built as a southern residence for Ramesses II of Sut. Under the king's orders, construction crews swiftly expanded and transformed this modest structure, adding a vast open courtyard bordered by double rows of columns shaped like papyrus bundles. This solar court reflected Amenhotep's growing devotion to sun worship, for which open, roofless spaces were far more appropriate than conventional enclosed temples. Similar sun courts were added to many temples across Egypt under his directive. The completed solar court at Luxor stands as one of the most breathtaking and impressive of all ancient Egyptian temple complexes. Its walls are covered in electrum, its furnishings are of silver, all its gateways gleam at their thresholds. Its pylon reaches the heavens, its flagpoles stand among the stars. When the people behold it, they will praise his majesty. In front of the solar court, an even grander structure arose, an immense colonnade hall with columns soaring over 60 feet high, adorned with 6 colossal statues of the king in striding poses. These architectural marvels were designed to awe, and they succeeded brilliantly. Yet the temple's true theological significance lay hidden in its rear chambers. Arguably the most important room in the entire complex is a small chamber located behind a bark shrine near the offering room. On its western wall, a finely carved relief portrays 2 goddesses gently supporting the figures of a man and a woman, or rather, Mutemwia and someone appearing as Thutmose IV. The text describes, in surprisingly vivid language, the god's covert visit to the queen's bedchamber and her eager reaction to his advances. She awoke to the god's fragrance and cried out with delight before his majesty. She rejoiced at his beauty, and love for him filled her entire being. Overcome with ecstasy, Mutemwia exclaims, "How mighty is your power! Your sweet fragrance strengthens all my limbs." The sexual symbolism is unmistakable. Following the conception, the divine announcement is declared. Amenhotep, ruler of Thebes, is the name of the child I have placed within your womb. He shall wield mighty kingship over this land. He shall rule the 2 lands like Ra forever. The purpose of this elaborate narrative was to reinforce the myth of the king's divine origin, a tradition that Egyptian monarchs had embraced for centuries to varying degrees. Earlier in the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut had also proclaimed her divine birth at her temple in Deir el-Bahri, though she avoided delving into explicit details. Amenhotep III, by contrast, reveled in the intimate portrayal of Amenhotep's union with the queen. Perhaps this openness was fitting for a ruler who filled his harem with numerous foreign marvels, and who even counted among his local concubines a woman nicknamed, "She whose nights on the town are many." After establishing the divine origins of the king, Luxor Temple offered yet another profound statement on the ideology of kingship. In fact, the temple's most astonishing secret lies in its true purpose. Unlike most temples in Egypt, it was not primarily dedicated to the worship of a deity. Its role as Amenhotep's southern residence served merely as a convenient facade, masking a deeper reality. The real significance of Luxor Temple in the mythology of Egyptian kingship is revealed in the reliefs adorning Amenhotep's grand colonnade. These depict the most significant ritual held at Luxor, the annual festival of Opet. Every year, the sacred images of Amenhotep, Mut, and Khonsu were transported from Sut to Luxor in a grand procession, either by land or by river. As the sacred bark shrines made their way through the streets, carried by priests, crowds gathered to catch sight of these holy figures and to receive their blessings. The Opet festival was a time of great celebration, feasting, and temporary relief from daily life. Yet, like most things in ancient Egypt, its ultimate purpose was not for the populace, but for the king. Once within Luxor Temple's sacred precinct, the images were removed from their barks and placed in their designated chambers. At this point, the king entered the sanctuary alone to commune privately with the image of Ammonius Ra. After this sacred encounter, he emerged into the Hall of Appearance, where priests and courtiers awaited to pay him homage. Special hieroglyphic markers at the base of columns indicated where the general public could stand to witness the proceedings. His transformation was evident to all, and one can assume that no one dared comment if there was anything amiss in his appearance. Through his intimate communion with the supreme God, the king had been spiritually renewed and his divinity reaffirmed. He had once again become the living son of Ammonius Ra. At the heart of this ceremony was the royal Ka. It was one of ancient Egypt's most ingenious theological concepts, resolving the paradox of a ruler who was both mortal and divine. The Opet festival provided the king with the opportunity to reunite with the royal Ka, becoming foremost of all the living castes, a god embodied on earth. Luxor Temple, therefore, was in essence a temple dedicated to the royal Ka. As always, Amenhotep ordered the creation of a magnificent sculpture to commemorate the extraordinary transformation brought about by the Opet festival. The statue of the rejuvenated Amenhotep III stands as one of the greatest masterpieces of ancient Egyptian art. Life-sized, it portrays the king striding forward with strength and confidence, his muscular torso and limbs embodying youthful vigor and masculinity. The most striking feature, however, is his face. With oversized almond-shaped eyes, full lips, a small, flat nose, and pronounced cheekbones, his features appear intentionally childlike, conveying an exaggerated sense of youth. The statue presents the king as literally rejuvenated, transformed back into a child through the magical power of the Opet ceremonies. The statue's symbolism extends far beyond its physical form. Its very material underscores the king's intimate connection to the sun god. Carved from a deep purplish-red quartzite, known to the ancient Egyptians as bayet, it would have originally been adorned with gilded accents on the collar, bracelets, sandals, and crown, allowing it to gleam like the sun in the open quartz daylight. A closer look at the back of the statue reveals a feather pattern on the king's buttocks, signifying his partial transformation into a celestial falcon. Further emphasizing his solar associations, the king's kilt is decorated with rearing cobras, each topped with a solar disk. Amenhotep wears the double crown and stands atop a sledge, both symbols linked to the creator god Adam. This rich blend of visual symbolism declares that Amenhotep III has been reborn, united with Ra and Adam, an eternal god king. The inscription carved into the back pillar reinforces this message, proclaiming him foremost of all the living castes and the dazzling orb of all lands. At this point, the deliberate and systematic amplification of royal power had reached its peak. No longer simply the son of Ra, the king had become one with the sun itself, the very creator god who brings light and life to the world. His transformation was complete. The deification of Amenhotep III during his lifetime, the elevation of Amenhotep III to divine status during his reign, closely tied to his first Jubilee celebration in 1361 BC, marked a significant departure for Egyptian kingship. While previous pharaohs had hinted at divinity, often portraying themselves with divine traits, there had always been a fine but deliberate separation between the king as Horus on earth and Horus himself, between being the chosen of Ra and Ra as the one who chose, between a monarch as Nefer, perfected or junior god, and the true gods. No ruler before Amenhotep III had so boldly and openly declared himself a living god, fully merging with the creator deity. This transformation is most clearly seen in distant Nubia, at the far southern boundary of Egypt's 18th dynasty power. Among Amenhotep's numerous construction projects was the establishment of a new temple inside the fortress of Kemet, present-day Salab, intended to secure Egyptian Nubia against the territories beyond. Reflecting his solar aspirations, the temple was situated on the west bank of the Nile, facing the sunrise. Initially, The temple served as a small shrine for Ammonius, the king's personal protector. However, it was later expanded with 2 solar courtyards and a columned hall filled with statues. Around the time Amenhotep reached his 30th regnal year, the temple's dedication was modified to honor both Ammonius Ra of Ipitsut residing in the fortress of Kemet and Nebmatra, Amenhotep III's throne name, Lord of Nubia. The union of Ammonius Ra, king of the gods, with Amenhotep III, the god king, formed a fitting divine pair. Reliefs at Kemet's temple also document aspects of the king's first jubilee. The ancient said festival, focused on renewal and rejuvenation, held particular significance for Amenhotep. He appears to have begun preparations well in advance. The construction of solar courtyards at his principal temples in both Egypt and Nubia likely anticipated this jubilee, symbolizing his ultimate unification with the sun god. In organizing the festival, every effort was made to ensure it surpassed all previous jubilees. Scholars were commissioned to consult ancient records and rediscover past practices. Among their findings was a ceremonial palette over 15 centuries old, dating back to the dawn of Egypt's history, bearing a simplified depiction of jubilee rites. Though limited, this revered artifact contributed valuable insights to their preparations. Given Thebes' central role in Amenhotep's religious innovations, it was appropriate that his jubilee ceremonies take place there. True to his grand style, the king ordered the construction of an entirely new ceremonial city. This new complex arose on the west bank of the Nile, south of his mortuary temple and directly across from Luxor Temple, the symbolic site of his rebirth. In its initial phase, the complex, modestly called Palace of the Dazzling Orb and the House of Rejoicing, modern Malkata, stretched nearly a mile. The city featured an administrative quarter with spacious villas for officials, a secondary palace, and the king's main residence. The lavish audience halls boasted floors adorned with brightly colored textiles and ceilings decorated with exotic Minoan designs. Amenhotep's bedroom ceiling was painted with soaring vultures interspersed with his royal titles. Tables veneered with ebony and inlaid with gold displayed elegant ointment jars and intricately crafted perfume bottles made of multicolored glass. Such glassware was so prized by the king and queen that a dedicated workshop was established near the palace to meet the high demand. Amenhotep's patronage of glassmaking has often been likened to Louis XIV's support for Sèvres porcelain. Amenhotep's ceremonial city and mortuary temple were linked by an elevated causeway, which extended southward for another mile and a half, ending at a secluded desert location, modern Qom el-Semak. There, following ancient tradition, the king sat enthroned on a raised platform with twin stairways, symbolizing his rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt. Beyond this site, unfinished royal structures dotted the remote Theban hills, though the full extent of Amenhotep's plans remains a matter of speculation. The imagination of the king and his advisors appeared limitless. The dazzling orb of all lands envisioned one final dramatic spectacle to crown his grand festival of kingship. A ceremonial city and an extravagant palace nestled within a sacred landscape were not enough for the ultimate jubilee. Recalling the rowing lake he had gifted to Queen Tai 2 decades earlier, Amenhotep conceived a new, unprecedented project. He ordered the creation of 2 colossal artificial harbors, matching in scale anything he had previously attempted. Each harbor stretched nearly half a mile in length and a quarter mile in width. The massive volume of earth excavated from the western basin was redistributed across the nearby plains, forming an artificial platform on which the Jubilee City would rise. Today, the western harbor, Birket Habu, remains visible as a depression marked by mounds of spoil, its true size only apparent from an aerial perspective. The Eastern harbor has since vanished beneath modern Luxor, though it was still recognizable when Napoleon visited Egypt, and he likely would have admired its original purpose. Amenhotep's vision was to stage the most awe-inspiring setting imaginable for the heart of his Jubilee ceremony. On the morning of the main celebration, courtiers, high officials, royal companions, and distinguished guests gathered inside the palace. There, The king bestowed lavish gifts upon them: golden necklaces, ornaments shaped like ducks and fish, and special jubilee ribbons made of green linen. The guests then enjoyed a grand breakfast banquet alongside the king before being led to the artificial harbors. What followed was a breathtaking display of royal authority and divine kingship. At the water's edge, Amenhotep III and Queen Tai appeared, resplendent in gold from head to toe, shining like the sun itself. At the eastern harbor, they boarded a replica of the sun god's morning bark. As a ritual reenactment of the sun's daily journey into the sky, the assembled courtiers took up the ropes and gently pulled the vessel forward, symbolically towing the sun god into the heavens at dawn. The procession then moved to the western harbor, where the king and queen reappeared, this time aboard a replica of the sun god's evening bark. Once again, dignitaries pulled the ropes, now portraying the sun's descent into the underworld at dusk. The spectacle was so magnificent that the master of ceremonies could later boast that, since the time of the ancestors, no generations had celebrated such jubilee rites. Amenhotep III would go on to celebrate a second and third jubilee, each accompanied by new monumental constructions and elaborate ceremonies. Then, unexpectedly, in 1353 BC, he died, still in his late 40s. His sudden death must have deeply shaken a population steeped in royal propaganda and a court that believed in the king's immortality. Yet no one could have anticipated the revolutionary upheaval that awaited Egypt under Amenhotep's successor. The brilliant sun of Egypt had set. When it rose again, it would blaze with a harsh, unyielding intensity. In the chronicles of ancient Egypt, no figure has sparked more debate and fascination than one particular ruler. He inspires both admiration and disdain in equal measure. From romantic novelists to opera composers, his magnetism has proven irresistible. During his relatively short life, he completely transformed Egypt, yet his sweeping reforms were swiftly undone after his death. He elevated the divine kingship to unprecedented heights, though he was never initially destined to rule. This is Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king, 1353 to 1336 BC, the most polarizing and mysterious of pharaohs, the architect of a royal revolution. His 17-year rule, followed by a chaotic decade, marks perhaps the most thrilling, unpredictable, dynamic, and peculiar era in Egypt's long history. Central to it all was the king's radical vision. Foremost of Amenhotep III's illustrious reign, the designated successor was Prince Thutmose, his eldest son, named according to royal custom after his grandfather and great-great-grandfather. Very little is recorded about his second son, Prince Amenhotep, as he was originally named, until Prince Thutmose's unexpected death, which thrust the younger brother into the position of crown prince. Thutmose left behind few monuments, aside from a stone sarcophagus he had crafted for his beloved pet cat. In contrast, his brother's resolve would reshape Egypt in just a single generation. The new heir must have personally witnessed his father's extravagant said festivals, experiences that clearly left a profound mark on him. The vivid solar symbolism of these ceremonies seems to have seared itself into the young man's creative mind. While there is no sign of theological radicalism at the start of Amenhotep's rule, any such revolutionary ideas must have been developing beneath the surface. Ascending the throne as Amenhotep IV, he initially fulfilled his duty as a devoted son, completing the decoration of his father's grand entrance at Ipit-Sut. He added his own carvings in the conventional style, depicting himself striking down Egypt's enemies. In Nubia, following in his father's footsteps, he established a new settlement, complete with a temple dedicated to Amenhotep, king of the gods. Distant rulers also recognized his ascension. From Cyprus, the king of Alatia sent congratulations and a gift of sweet oil to mark his coronation. Everything appeared poised for yet another glorious reign, following the familiar dynastic pattern. Egypt's imperial territories reaffirmed their loyalty as well. One particularly flattering letter arrived from the vassal king of Tyre, overflowing with customary expressions of devotion. I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times. I am but the dust beneath the sandals of the king, my lord. My lord is the sun who rises over all lands each day. Such declarations seem to ignite new ambitions in Amenhotep IV. Within a year of his accession, he revealed his true intentions by launching a building campaign that rivaled his father's grandeur. The sandstone quarries at Gebel el-Silsila were pushed to their limits, worked by unprecedented numbers of conscripted laborers recruited through a nationwide call to service. Monumental structures adorned with royal statues were nothing unfamiliar to Thebes, which had grown accustomed to grandiose constructions during the later years of Amenhotep III's reign. Yet Amenhotep IV's vision diverged significantly. His projects would be concentrated at a single location, the temple complex of Ipit-Sut. Instead, he chose a vacant mudflat beyond the eastern wall, directly facing the rising sun. This carefully selected site lay outside the domain of Ammon-Ra, signaling a deliberate break with tradition. Amenhotep IV's 8 new temples at Ipit-Sut were not dedicated to Ammonius, but to the Aten, the visible solar disk, whose imagery his father had previously embraced during his first jubilee. The most ambitious of these new structures was the temple named Akhetaten. The Aten is found, rivaling any project Thebes had seen in the previous reign. Its centerpiece was a vast open court encircled by a colonnade. Towering 20-foot statues of Amenhotep IV and his wife, Nefertiti, stood before the columns. Their distinctive crowns marked their divine affiliations. The king wore either the double crown or a twin-plumed headdress, while Nefertiti's flat-top crown identified them with the primeval creator gods Adam, Shu, and Tefnut from the ancient Yuna myth. While Amenhotep III had emphasized his role as the sustaining force of the cosmos, his son sought association with the very act of creation itself. This theological radicalism was strikingly reflected in the king's statues. To express his unity with the creator and embody both masculine and feminine aspects, while simultaneously distinguishing himself from ordinary humanity, Amenhotep IV instructed his sculptors to adopt a radically new artistic style. His statues featured intentionally exaggerated forms, elongated skulls, sharp and stretched facial features including narrow eyes, a long nose, and a prominent chin. A sinewy neck with pronounced collarbones above a narrow chest that contrasted with a swollen belly and wide hips, plump thighs tapering to slender calves. The result was both unsettling and surreal. Adding another layer of innovation, plaques bearing a pair of royal names were placed at key points on the statues. Yet instead of identifying Amenhotep IV, these inscriptions proclaimed the newly devised titulary of the Aten, his favored deity. Under Amenhotep III, the king had been likened to the solar orb. Under his son, the solar orb had, in effect, become king. Amenhotep IV was proclaiming nothing less than a dual rule, a co-sovereignty share between himself and the Aten. The abundant reliefs adorning the Akhetaten reinforced this new religious order. The royal family was consistently depicted in the presence of the Aten, no longer shown in the traditional form of a falcon-headed god, but rather as a radiant solar disk, its rays terminating in human hands that gently touched and sustained the royal figures. The ultimate aim of Amenhotep IV's entire building project at Akhetaten was to create a magnificent architectural stage for the celebration of a royal jubilee. In the 3rd year of his reign, Amenhotep IV held his own said festival, maintaining the same schedule established by his father. Through this act, he clearly conveyed that his father's reign had, in a sense, never truly ended. The inscription stressed that this said festival was not primarily for the king himself, but for the Aten. This represented a bold yet natural progression of Amenhotep III's religious doctrine. The deceased king had become the sun itself, destined to reign eternally, with repeated jubilees performed on his behalf by his son. The said festival at Ipit-Sut was therefore not a conclusion, but the inauguration of a new age. The sun god and king would now rule together, recreating the world with each new day. These Jubilee festivities also pointed towards a dramatic transformation in Egyptian religious life. Traditional processions of the gods were abandoned. In their place, the king and his family became the central focus of devotion. Each day, they traveled in ceremonial procession from palace to temple and back again, with cheering crowds and assembled dignitaries lining the route in reverence. A year after the said festival at Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV solidified his religious revolution by changing his own name. While many rulers had altered their throne names to reflect new directions, it was extremely rare, if not entirely without precedent, for a king to change his birth name. Through the transformative power of the Jubilee, Amenhotep IV believed he had been spiritually reborn as the co-regent of the Aten. No longer bearing the name Amenhotep, meaning Ammonius is content, he adopted a new identity, Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. Such an overt rejection of the Ammonius cult must have sat uneasily alongside the king's continued presence in Thebes, the very heart of Ammonius worship. While the Akhenaten and the other Aten temples were built outside the sacred enclosure of Ipitsut, the towering monuments dedicated to Ammonius on both sides of the Nile still dominated the landscape, serving as constant reminders of his overwhelming supremacy over all other deities. If the Aten was to be elevated above all others, he required not just temples, but an entirely new domain. Thus began the search for a new royal capital. Akhenaten's choice of location was nothing short of extraordinary. He even claimed that it was the Aten who guided him there. In Middle Egypt, roughly halfway between Thebes and the long-established administrative center of Memphis, lay a wide desert bay where the limestone cliffs on the east bank of the Nile receded, creating a natural amphitheater around 7 miles long and 3 miles wide. The site was remote, easily defensible, and conveniently located opposite a broad, fertile floodplain. Most significantly, it was untouched. Even the natural landscape seemed made for his vision. The shape of the eastern cliffs resembled the hieroglyph for horizon, the place where the sun rises to renew life each day. It was fittingly named Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, a perfect setting for Akhenaten's utopian project. In the late spring of his 5th regnal year, 1349 BC, the king made his first official visit to the site, appearing before his courtiers in a golden chariot gleaming like the sun. There, after a grand open-air offering to the Aten before the cliffs, he formally proclaimed the establishment of his new city, dedicating it to his god for eternity as his monument, with an eternal and everlasting name. Not even Queen Nefertiti could sway his determination, as he firmly declared, "Nor shall the king's great wife say to me, 'Look, there's a good place for Akhetaten elsewhere,' nor shall I listen to her." The king also decreed that the city would contain grand structures for the worship of the Aten and for the exaltation of the royal family. Akhetaten, not Thebes, would become his eternal resting place. "If I die in any town of the north, the south, the west, or the east in these millions of years, let me be brought back so that I may be buried in Akhetaten." The entire ceremony, along with the king's declaration, was inscribed on 3 immense, steely carved into the cliffs at the northern and southern edges of the site, adorned with statues of the king and queen to commemorate the moment. Exactly 1 year later, Akhenaten returned to survey the city's progress. After spending the night in a richly carpeted tent named Aten is Content, he once again rode out at sunrise in his gilded chariot, made another offering to the Aten, and took a solemn oath, in the name of the Aten and the lives of his wife and daughters, that everything within Akhetaten would belong solely to the Aten for all eternity. This second decree, which more precisely defined the city's boundaries, was carved onto an additional set of 13 boundary markers positioned on both sides of the Nile. The pace of construction accelerated rapidly. Massive amounts of stone were extracted from a vast quarry cut into the northern cliffs. Builders used standardized stone blocks small enough for a single worker to handle, which allowed for swift progress. After 2 years of intense activity, the new city was ready to receive the royal family as their permanent home. As Akhenaten had envisioned, the horizon of the Aten was meticulously designed to highlight its major public buildings. These key structures were connected by the royal road, which ran parallel to the Nile, forming the ceremonial spine of the capital. Each day, the king's chariot journey from his royal residence to the seat of government and back deliberately echoed the Aten's daily passage across the sky, symbolizing the intimate relationship between the heavenly and earthly co-regents. This daily procession also provided the city and its inhabitants with a consistent ritual focus, replacing the traditional religious festivals that the king's new theology had effectively abolished. The primary royal residence was situated at the northernmost edge of Akhetaten, nestled between the cliffs and the river. Within its fortified walls stood the palace itself, supported by extensive barracks housing the royal guards. Nearby were a large administrative building and an array of grand mansions reserved for the king's most trusted advisors. Each morning, as the king proceeded southward in his chariot, his route first carried him past a separate palace dedicated to the royal harem. Lavishly adorned with painted murals and gilded stonework, this residence offered a serene and luxurious retreat. Its central courtyard featured exquisitely maintained gardens, irrigated by an advanced system drawing water from the Nile. Stalls housing cattle and domesticated antelope ensured a steady supply of fine meats for the palace's daily feasts. Beyond this royal compound lay the heart of the city itself. One can imagine the king's cavalcade quickening its pace as it passed by the homes of ordinary citizens. To the east of the royal road sprawled the northern suburb, one of Akhenaten's two primary residential districts. While the city's public buildings reflected careful urban planning, the same could not be said for the layout of its neighborhoods. The houses of the populace were clustered in a haphazard fashion, with large villas belonging to prosperous merchants surrounded by smaller dwellings for their servants and dependents. A labyrinth of narrow streets and winding alleys contributed to the village-like atmosphere. These neighborhoods buzzed with activity, constantly evolving as new homes were constructed and the city expanded. Continuing south along the royal road, the king's chariot procession finally entered the central city, the religious and administrative core of Akhetaten. The most imposing structure was the House of the Aten, the god's principal sanctuary, with a street frontage stretching 750 feet and extending nearly half a mile deep. Beyond its two colossal entrance towers lay enormous open courtyards filled with mud brick altars. During festivals, these altars would be piled high with offerings of fruit, vegetables, meat, and poultry, presented for the Aten's consumption as he passed overhead in the sky. The temple complex included large-scale food production facilities and a dedicated slaughterhouse to ensure a constant supply for the offerings. Adjacent to the temple stood the king's house, Akhenaten's governmental headquarters, where the day-to-day affairs of the state were managed. One of its most notable features was a balcony, used for public appearances by the royal family. A covered bridge extended over the royal road, connecting the king's house to the Great Palace. Primarily used for grand state receptions and royal ceremonies, the Great Palace also housed administrative offices and accommodations for the royal household. Its centerpiece was a vast open courtyard lined with towering statues of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, intended to impress foreign dignitaries and envoys. The atmosphere of awe and intimidation was heightened by the palace's unique floor decoration. The pathway most often used by the king was covered with plastered images of foreigners, allowing Akhenaten to symbolically trample his enemies as he conducted his affairs. The final major building in the central city was the Mansion of the Aten, a smaller temple intended for the royal family's private, daily worship. Aligned with the cleft in the eastern cliffs that led to the royal tomb, it may have functioned as a substitute for a traditional mortuary temple. Like the House of the Aten, its design was characterized by vast, open courts, ideal for worshiping the visible sun. Rather than enclosed chambers, a series of ramps, steps, and balustrades structured the sacred space, reflecting the new religious vision. Akhenaten's revolutionary theology had given rise to an equally revolutionary architectural style. Further south, another residential suburb emerged. This one inhabited primarily by common workers and lying beyond the areas typically visited by the king. Yet even here, Akhenaten's presence was inescapable. On the outskirts of the city stood 5 large ritual complexes, each dedicated to an important female member of the royal family. These monuments ensured that wherever the city's residents turned, the royal family's influence remained both highly visible and deeply entrenched. In his new son's city, Akhenaten was not only all-powerful but ever-present. In some ways, Akhenaten's strict religious ideology had its roots in his father's deification. The leap from Amenhotep III's exaltation of solar power to his son's exclusive worship of sunlight itself was a small, almost inevitable step. It is even conceivable that Akhenaten viewed the Aten not only as his divine protector, but as his actual father. Yet in most crucial aspects, Akhenaten's theology was unprecedented, breaking sharply from 17 centuries of established Egyptian religious tradition. Where earlier pharaohs emphasized their role in upholding Mot, Akhenaten claimed to exist within Mot like the gods themselves. Truth was no longer a universal standard outside the king. Instead, it was defined solely by his will. Traditional ceremonies of royal renewal, like the Sed and Opet festivals, had marked periodic rejuvenation for the king, to be repeated at set intervals. But Akhenaten's Sed festival at Ipit Sut, conducted while he was still Amenhotep IV, carried an entirely different significance. It proclaimed the permanent rejuvenation of both king and cosmos. Through his joint rule with the Aten, Akhenaten intended to return the world to its original, pristine state immediately following creation. His universe was one of continual rebirth, mirroring the daily rise of the sun, governed by the divine triad of the Aten, the king, and his queen. While the doctrine was spiritually ambitious, its practical consequences were revolutionary. A god whose power radiated through light itself had no need for enclosed, shadowy sanctuaries, which had been central to Egyptian worship since the earliest days of civilization. The Aten demanded open-air temples, filled with offering tables piled high, with food for direct exposure to the god's rays. In truth, the entire city of Akhetaten was conceived as one grand temple to the Aten, where the visible sun could be honored at any hour. This concept was clearly reflected in the Aten's so-called royal name at the time of its jubilee in 1351. Written inside the cartouche typically reserved for kings, the name was actually a condensed declaration of the new belief system. Live, Pharaohs of the horizons, who rejoices on the horizon in his name of light, which is the Aten. Just as Akhenaten embodied light itself, so his city, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, became the site where God, king, and holy city were perfectly unified. Although, in theory, the Aten required neither temples nor a priesthood, Akhenaten could not personally conduct every act of worship, no matter how devoted he may have been. After all, he was both head of state and prophet of a new faith. Thus, following established precedent, he appointed a high priest of the Aten soon after relocating to Akhetaten. Moiraira, whose name meant beloved of Ra, emerged from obscurity. Like most of Akhenaten's closest associates, he owed his position entirely to the king, ensuring his unwavering loyalty. Moiraira's formal installation as high priest took place at the king's house in the central city. Akhenaten, accompanied by Nefertiti and their eldest daughter, Akhetaten, appeared on a richly adorned royal balcony, its cushions embroidered for the occasion. Dressed in a long white robe and decorative sash, Moiraira, attended by his household, approached the royal presence and knelt before the king as scribes diligently recorded every detail of the ceremony. Behind the scribes stood baton-wielding enforcers, ready to act should any disturbance arise. Police, like scribes, were a constant presence in Akhetaten's daily life. With a formal proclamation, the king confirmed Moiraira's appointment, met with universal acclamation. When the celebration quieted, Moiraira delivered his brief but devout speech of acceptance. Numerous are the rewards that the Aten knows to give, pleasing his heart. His friends then lifted him onto their shoulders and carried him from the palace in triumph. One of the major highlights of Merira's career came several years later, when he was awarded the Gold of Honor, the highest reward for a loyal servant. After the king draped multiple gold collars around his neck, the entire assembly was obliged to listen in attentive silence as Akhenaten delivered an extended, formal, and highly ceremonial speech. With its ritualized setting and carefully orchestrated actions, Merira's appointment as high priest brought to life a style of royal audience that has remained surprisingly consistent across millennia. His subsequent investiture served as another reminder of the age-old dynamic between absolute rulers and their submissive courtiers. Around the same time as Merira's rise to high priesthood, Akhenaten began to circulate a more developed articulation of his religious philosophy. This new doctrine, ominously titled the Teaching, was composed in the everyday, spoken language rather than the classical, more formal dialect of earlier times. It is widely believed to have been written by the king himself. Officially known as the Great Hymn to the Aten, this composition has been described as one of the most remarkable and magnificent pieces of poetry to have survived from the pre-Homeric world. Its ecstatic tone and vivid portrayal of the creator's power would later inspire other religious writings, including the Hebrew Psalms. By having the hymn carefully inscribed in the tombs of his top officials as a visible demonstration of loyalty to the regime, Akhenaten ensured its survival for posterity. It is worth quoting extensively, as nothing better conveys the rapturous joy that defined the king's religious vision. You shine forth in splendor upon the horizon of the sky, O living Aten, creator of life. When you rise upon the eastern horizon, you fill every land with your radiance. Majestic, resplendent, brilliant, high above all lands, your rays encompass everything you have made. The earth glows when you appear on the horizon, and shine as Aten in the daylight. You chase away the darkness as you extend your beams. The two lands rejoice. All herds rest peacefully in their pastures. Trees and plants flourish. Birds take wing from their nests. Fish leap from the river in your presence. Your rays reach even the depths of the sea. How numerous are your works, though hidden from sight. Sole God, apart from whom none exists. You shape the earth by your will alone. All people, livestock, and creatures, all who walk on land, all who soar on wings, your rays nourish every pasture. At your rising, they live and thrive because of you. You created the seasons to nurture all your creations, winter to cool them, heat that they might feel your presence. The hymn's celebration of abundance and the splendor of creation found its visual counterpart in the lavish decoration of the royal palaces, with brilliantly painted walls, ceilings, and floors. Yet, for most of Akhetaten's ordinary inhabitants, these opulent displays were a distant reality. Cramped alongside the grand temples and palaces, the common people endured lives of hardship and deprivation. The skeletal remains they left behind reveal the severe strains of poor nutrition, chronic stress, and relentless physical labor. Some suffered permanent spinal injuries from carrying heavy loads day after day, while others spent long hours squatting or kneeling on earthen floors, laboring over furnaces to produce glass or metal in the city's workshops. Undernourished from childhood, both men and women were often stunted and plagued by debilitating illnesses like anemia. Over half the population perished before reaching their 20s, and few lived beyond their 40s. Most were dead by 35, laid to rest in shallow graves dug directly into the desert sand, marked only by modest stone cairns. A few cheap pots or worn-out trinkets might accompany them to the afterlife. This grim reality stood in stark contrast to the official doctrine of light, life, and beauty. Perhaps it is little surprise that many of Akhenaten's less privileged subjects continued to quietly honor the old gods, even under the scrutiny of the king's enforcers. Within the privacy of their humble homes, beloved deities such as Hathor, Bes, Taret, and even Ammonius still held a cherished place in daily life. Whether as a reaction to or as a consequence of a lingering devotion to the old gods, Akhenaten's religious vision became increasingly extreme. In the early years of his reign, while the royal court remained at Thebes, it was still permissible for officials such as royal butlers to include prayers to deities like Osiris and Anubis in their tombs. However, after relocating to Akhetaten, the Aten was rapidly exalted from being the supreme god to becoming the only god. All other deities were now denied recognition or legitimacy. Akhenaten was determined to enforce his vision across society. Priests were dismissed or reassigned, temples were shuttered, and all financial and material resources were funneled into the service of the Aten. The height of Akhenaten's religious radicalism came in the 11th year of his reign, 1341 BCE, when the Atenist doctrine was officially purified. This revision eliminated any mention of deities other than Aten or Ra. Alongside this theological purge came an aggressive campaign against other gods, most notably Ammonius, whom Aten had displaced as creator and supreme deity. To erase Ammonius' presence from public memory, Akhenaten launched a state-directed wave of destruction. Across Egypt, from the Nile Delta to distant Nubia, teams of royal agents stormed tombs and temples, defacing sacred inscriptions and imagery. Carrying chisels and guided by cue cards with illustrations to assist illiterate laborers, they climbed obelisks to chip away at figures and names, erasing any mention of Ammonius Ra. Personal names containing the elements Ammonius or Mut were targeted as well. The official desecration extended so far that even the plural form of the word God was eliminated. Terrified by this religious crackdown, individuals scrambled to protect themselves, defacing or altering their own possessions, and even changing their names to avoid persecution. A scribe named Tammuz quickly changed his name to Ahmose. A priest named Merenith became Meri-Ra, only daring to resume his original name after Akhenaten's death. To many Egyptians, this campaign of destruction must have felt like a violent assault on their deepest hopes and long-held beliefs. Yet Akhenaten remained unwavering, his doctrine uncompromising. The Aten was not only the sole god, but salvation itself was possible only through Akhenaten, throne name Nefertiti, and his family. His teaching proclaimed, "There is no one else who knows you, only your son, Nefertiti, the sole one of Ra. You have revealed your plans and your might to him. All those who have lived since you created the earth have been raised up for your son, the one born from your body, the dual king who lives by truth, Lord of the two lands. Nefertiti, sole one of Ra, the son of Ra who lives by truth, Lord of diadems. Akhenaten, whose life is long, and the king's great wife, his beloved, Lady of the Two Lands. Nefertiti, living in youthful forever and ever." The final verses of the great hymn to the Aten highlight one of the most remarkable aspects of Akhenaten's revolutionary reign. In some respects, Nefertiti was following a tradition already established by earlier women of the 18th dynasty. From Tetisheri, Amenhotep, and almost Nefertiti to Hatshepsut, royal women had grown accustomed to playing influential roles in political life. Tai, Akhenaten's mother, advanced this even further by engaging in diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers and appearing alongside Amenhotep III, embodying a divine partnership with him. However, Nefertiti took this to unprecedented heights from the very beginning. At Ipit Sut, she was granted her own sanctuary, the mansion of the Benben, where her husband did not even appear. She was depicted performing rituals previously reserved for the king alone, such as striking down enemies or reviewing captives. On the boundaries steely commemorating the royal couple's first visit to Akhetaten, Nefertiti is portrayed at the same scale as Akhenaten, signifying equal status. Akhenaten's accompanying him further emphasized her elevated position. Great in the palace, beautiful of face, adorned with the twin plumes, Lady of Joy who receives praises. One delights to hear her voice, the beloved great wife of the king, mistress of the two lands. Every act Akhenaten performed to honor the Aten was mirrored by Nefertiti. When he changed his name from Amenhotep, she also added an epithet to hers. As Akhenaten embodied Shu, the son of the creator god, Nefertiti represented Tefnut, Shu's consort. She adopted Tefnut's distinct flat-topped crown as her own, making it a symbol of her authority. In the tomb of her chief steward, the couple are depicted standing side by side, their figures almost merging into one. To some, Nefertiti and Akhenaten appeared as inseparable co-rulers on earth, complementing the Aten in heaven. Their close bond became a central theme of Akhenaten's religious vision, showcased in statues and reliefs across the city. In one scene, they are shown holding hands during an official ceremony. In another, Nefertiti sits on Akhenaten's lap as she fastens a bead necklace around his neck. A temple relief fragment even portrays them getting in a bed together. Their daughters were also prominently featured in official imagery. Within 2 years of settling in Amarna, Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters. Although Akhenaten fathered at least one son with a lesser wife, this son was conspicuously absent from official depictions, as the feminine principle was emphasized. A well-known stela shows the royal family at leisure with their 3 eldest daughters. Akhenaten cradles and kisses Akhetaten. Akhetaten sits on Nefertiti's knee, reaching out to her father, and young Akhetaten tugs playfully at her mother's earring. Such open displays of affection and emotion within the royal family were entirely without precedent. The motivation behind this dramatic break from tradition lay in the new role the royal family assumed within Egyptian religion. They had become a sacred family, displacing the traditional pantheon of gods. The royal chariot rides through the heart of the city replaced the former processions of deities. Statues of Akhenaten and Nefertiti took the place of divine images. Since Atenism was an exclusive faith revealed solely to Akhenaten and his family, ordinary people seeking blessings from the sun god had to approach its earthly representatives as intermediaries. In the tombs of favored officials, carved into the cliffs surrounding Akhetaten, personal identity was subsumed beneath the worship of the king. The traditional offering prayers, once directed to Osiris, the god of the dead, were now dedicated to the king, and sometimes to Nefertiti as well. The only form of eternal existence now offered was to enjoy the Aten's rays during daylight, partake in temple offerings, and return to one's tomb at night under Akhenaten's watchful gaze. Within their homes, Akhetaten's residents kept statues and images of the royal family in private shrines. The scale of these household sanctuaries became a public display of loyalty to the regime, as significant a status symbol as a well-stocked granary, a private well, or a lush garden. For the common people who were excluded from the Aten's formal temples, there was at least one place open for worship in the city center, a chapel dedicated to the king's statue. Yet not everyone embraced this absolute devotion to Akhenaten and his religious reforms. Hints from the earliest boundary stele suggest that discontent may have arisen during the early years of his rule. Akhenaten's radical changes likely stirred strong opposition among certain groups, and the threat of rebellion was a constant concern. Loyal officials warned would-be dissenters of the king's resolve to suppress any opposition. As soon as he rises, he exerts his power against those who ignore his teachings. Even within his new capital, Akhenaten's personal security remained a major concern, and Akhetaten was heavily guarded. In addition to the police, soldiers and army commanders constantly surrounded His Majesty. Each day, Akhenaten's chariot rides through the city were escorted by armed guards bristling with spears. Behind the king's residence, an entire city block was allocated to barracks housing paramilitary forces, supplemented by additional garrisons throughout the city. A complex system of pathways crisscrossed the plain, allowing the desert behind Akhetaten to be patrolled efficiently. Visible both day and night, these routes enabled military chariots to maintain round-the-clock security. The desolate terrain of the eastern desert provided convenient hiding places for outlaws, and the authorities were ever vigilant for dissidents who would join those in the desert hills. Mobile police patrols kept constant watch over the royal palace from high on the surrounding plateau, while the steep cliffs behind the residence made it nearly impossible to approach or escape with ease. Like many autocrats throughout history, Akhenaten placed great trust in the loyalty of his security forces, especially his chief of police. Mahu, like all of the king's senior officials, owed his entire career to royal favor and was careful to show his unwavering allegiance. His tomb walls were adorned with no fewer than 4 versions of the hymn to the Aten, the official doctrine of Akhenaten's new faith. Mahu's public demonstrations of loyalty in the king's presence were textbook examples of flattery. Yet even in such an atmosphere of constant suspicion, total control of security was not entrusted to any one person. Akhenaten also maintained a personal guard composed of elite soldiers, including foreigners who were perhaps less likely to bear personal grievances against him. Some of the top administrative figures may also have come from non-Egyptian backgrounds. The vizier Aparel, the royal physician Pentu, and the chamberlain Tutu are all thought to have had foreign ancestry. Although the royal family was regarded as divine on earth and the sole channel to salvation, they still had to look beyond their own people to secure unquestioning loyalty. The last grand public appearance of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their 6 daughters took place in 1342 during the 12th year of his reign, in a spectacular royal durbar. Seated together beneath a sunshade, they observed as foreign dignitaries filed past, offering exotic gifts. These tributes served as a vivid display of the king's far-reaching power, likened to the all-encompassing radiance of the sun, as the official account described it. The appearance of the dual king Nefertiti and his great wife Nefertiti upon the great electrum palanquin to receive the tribute of Syria and Kush from the west and the east, with every foreign land gathered on this single occasion offering their gifts to the king. Not every foreign ruler appreciated this extravagant demonstration of Egyptian supremacy. In a sharply worded letter to Akhenaten, King Ashurballit of Assyria protested, "Why should my messengers be forced to stand constantly in the sun and die beneath its rays?" How ungrateful, it seemed, for the Assyrian envoy to object to such generous exposure to the Aten's life-giving light. Divine favor had its limits. The foreign envoys had scarcely departed from Akhetaten when tragedy struck the royal household. Akhenaten's second daughter, Akhetaten, passed away at the young age of 7, followed not long after by the death of the king's deeply cherished mother Tai. As Akhenaten had decreed, both were buried in the royal tomb, cut into the hills of a remote desert valley to the east of the city, 8 miles away. Vivid scenes of mourning etched into the tomb walls capture the profound grief of their family. The final depiction of Nefertiti in Akhetaten shows her weeping over her deceased daughter. After this, she vanishes entirely from the historical record. Perhaps she fell victim to the same misfortune that claimed her mother-in-law and child. Or perhaps Akhenaten, now confronted by death so close to home, re-evaluated her role. Soon after Nefertiti's disappearance, Akhenaten appointed a co-regent. The new co-ruler bore the name Nefertiti, echoing part of Nefertiti's own royal name. It appears that Nefertiti herself had become king. Who better, who more trustworthy, to carry forward Akhenaten's revolutionary vision than his closest partner and ally? Akhenaten died following the autumn grape harvest of 1336, ending his 17-year reign. His burial in the royal tomb included symbolic and telling grave goods. Not surprisingly, he chose as an heirloom a 1,000-year-old stone vessel once owned by Khafra, builder of the Great Sphinx. More surprising, however, were the Shabdi figurines inscribed for Akhenaten himself, intended to serve him in an afterlife his own doctrine had long rejected. Even the most devout zealots, it seems, may harbor final moments of doubt. His stone sarcophagus was guarded at each corner not by the traditional 4 funerary goddesses, but by figures representing his beloved Nefertiti. Though Nefertiti would watch over his remains, she could not protect his legacy. Graffiti found in a Theban tomb dated to the 3rd year of Nefertiti's reign suggests the beginnings of reconciliation with the old Ammonius priesthood and possibly the reopening of a temple to Ammonius in his traditional stronghold. Even before Akhenaten's body had fully settled into its grave, the exclusive cult of Aten was already fading. Akhenaten's death threw the royal court and the entire country into a state of crisis. Loyalists who had depended on his patronage must have desperately hoped for his revolution, or at least his regime, to endure. Yet others, especially members of the powerful Ammonius priesthood who had quietly waited for his religious experiment to run its course, seized the chance to restore the old faith. Even within the royal family, uncertainty and division emerged. A short-lived ruler named Smenkhera briefly ascended the throne between 1333 and 1332. Perhaps he was an otherwise unknown son of Akhenaten. More likely, it was Nefertiti once more, now ruling alone under a new name, supported by Akhetaten, who had been elevated to the role of great royal wife. But conservative forces were gathering strength and looked to the next generation for a ruler who carried royal blood, yet was young enough to be molded to their will. Hidden from public view for most of his life, Akhenaten's 9-year-old son by a lesser wife seemed the perfect choice. His marriage to Nefertiti's daughter, Akhetaten, further cemented his claim to power. The courtiers, priests, and military leaders reached a consensus. He would be king. His name was Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. Within months of a young pharaoh's ascension, those controlling the throne swiftly began steering Egypt back toward its ancient traditions. Under their careful direction, the king consented to change his name, publicly rejecting the Aten in favor of Ammonius. History had come full circle. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamen. His wife Akhetaten adopted the name Akhetaten, meaning she lives for Ammonius. Soon after, a grand restoration decree was issued in the king's name. Proclaimed from Memphis, the traditional capital, the decree condemned Akhenaten's policies without naming him directly. When His Majesty came to power, the temples of the gods and goddesses, from Abu to the Delta marshes, lay in ruin. Their sanctuaries had crumbled, overgrown with weeds. The land was in distress. The gods had abandoned Egypt. Military campaigns sent to expand Egypt's borders in the Near East met with failure. Those who prayed for divine protection received no answer. The decree emphasized the gods in the plural, and the young king's actions reflected this shift. Temples were repaired, especially those dedicated to Ammonius. Priesthoods were reinstated, and new cult statues were commissioned at the royal treasury's expense. In doing so, Tutankhamen was said to have restored what was broken and banished chaos from the two lands. The royal court's departure from Akhetaten and return to Thebes confirmed the complete restoration of the old order. To mark this decisive break with his father's radical experiment, the boy king, like earlier reunifiers, took the symbolic title Repeater of Births, signaling not a recreation but a renaissance. Yet so much promise was tragically cut short. Tutankhamen died in 1322, before even reaching adulthood. Perhaps he had secretly intended to rehabilitate Akhenaten's legacy once he reached full power. Perhaps those who truly held power feared this possibility and acted to prevent it. Or perhaps the frail young king simply succumbed to illness, like many of his subjects. His young wife attempted to continue the royal line, but her youth and the limited gene pool of a sibling marriage led to tragedy. 2 stillborn daughters were carefully mummified and buried beside their father in his hastily prepared tomb in the Valley of the Kings, waiting over 3,000 years to be rediscovered alongside his famed burial treasures. Tutankhamen's grieving widow understood the grim future that awaited her. As the last living descendant of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and of Amenhotep III's lineage, she held the keys to Egypt's throne. In a desperate attempt to escape her fate, she sent an unprecedented appeal to the Hittite king, pleading for him to send one of his sons to Egypt to marry her and rule alongside her. She wrote, "Never shall I take a servant of mine and make him my husband." The Hittite king was astonished telling his court, "Nothing like this has ever happened to me before." Eventually, he agreed and sent a prince, Zenanza, south toward Egypt. But Zenanza never arrived, dying on his journey. Akhenaten's worst fears were realized. She was forced into marriage with an elderly court official, a man old enough to be her grandfather, eager to claim power for himself. With her duty fulfilled, she too vanished from history, her fate unknown. Thus ended the Thutmoside dynasty, one of Egypt's most illustrious royal lines, which had produced powerful conquerors and brilliant rulers. The golden age of Amenhotep III was now only a distant memory. Egypt, weakened abroad and dispirited at home, needed strong leadership to restore its glory. As it happened, there remained one institution and one man at its helm, ready to provide that leadership. Egypt's expanding engagement in foreign affairs profoundly reshaped both the nation and its governance. Increased contact with foreign peoples and cultures brought new ideas and customs into Egyptian life, influencing everything from art and architecture to both state and private religion. Reflecting the militaristic spirit of the time, royal imagery became heavily martial, with the king frequently depicted on temple reliefs as a mighty warlord. This emphasis on military prowess extended throughout society, marking the new kingdom as an era dominated by soldiers. From modest beginnings, the Egyptian military rapidly grew into one of the most influential sectors of society. In earlier periods, during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, Egypt's rulers had relied on conscripted armies, assembled as needed from the general population and supplemented by mercenaries, often recruited from Nubia. While this approach was sufficient for sporadic raids to defend national interests or open trade routes, it was inadequate for maintaining a vast empire. The conquest and annexation of foreign lands required permanent garrisons to enforce Egyptian rule, backed by the constant threat of overwhelming force to suppress any rebellion. Only a full-time standing army could meet these demands. Thus, at the dawn of the new kingdom, Egypt reorganized its military into a professional, permanent force. By the reign of Akhenaten, the military's influence extended deeply into the heart of government, with many of the king's closest allies holding both military and civilian positions, thereby securing a loyal and powerful support base for the throne. During the later 18th dynasty, the military was restructured into two primary branches, infantry and chariotry. Egypt also maintained a strong naval tradition, which had been particularly effective in battles against the Hyksos. The close integration of land and naval forces was reflected in the fluid assignment of soldiers and officers, who frequently rotated between army and navy roles. A major naval base operated at Memphis, the capital's port, while another, located at the former Hyksos stronghold of Hutweret, fittingly bore the name Perunefer, meaning good voyage. Military garrisons were likely stationed in provincial centers across the country to enable swift response during emergencies, while a sizable force of reservists near Memphis served as a deterrent to any internal threats. The basic tactical unit of the infantry was a platoon of 50 soldiers, led by a platoon commander, the lowest-ranking officer. Each platoon was divided into 5 squads of 10 men, each headed by its own squad leader. This structure encouraged teamwork and fostered strong unit cohesion, vital for military success. 4 or 5 platoons formed a company, which included a quartermaster and an adjutant, under the leadership of a standard-bearer. Companies could be grouped into battalions as operational needs dictated, and during major campaigns, battalions were consolidated into larger regiments or divisions, each commanded by a general and named after one of Egypt's state gods. The chariotry was similarly organized into units of 50, primarily led by officers, much like the cavalry of late 19th century European imperial armies. Life as an infantryman in the pharaoh's army might have offered chances for adventure and upward mobility, but it was far from easy. Even for volunteers, training was harsh and often involved indiscriminate beatings. Although a corps of military scribes managed records and distributed provisions, rations on campaign were extremely limited. Soldiers had to supplement their diet of bread and water through foraging or outright theft. It is hardly surprising that during the Battle of Megiddo, many Egyptian troops focused more on looting enemy supplies than capturing the town itself. Some soldiers likely hadn't had a full meal in weeks, nor could an infantryman simply walk away from such a grim existence. His only way out was death in combat or promotion through the ranks. Desertion was severely punished. If the conditions for Egyptian recruits were harsh, they were even worse for foreign prisoners of war forcibly conscripted into the ranks. These captives were branded, officially registered, and sometimes even circumcised as part of their forced assimilation into Egyptian culture. Only those who managed to survive years of active service could hope for an honorable retirement, farming a plot of land granted by the state. When the Egyptian army set out for battle, a soldier's basic gear included a pack, clothing, sandals, and a staff or cudgel for self-defense. Advanced weaponry was distributed only when battle was imminent, as warfare still revolved around set-piece confrontations. Before fighting began, soldiers removed their sandals and fought barefoot. Body armor was rare, as it restricted movement on the battlefield. Apart from a shield and perhaps a quilted leather jerkin, infantrymen had to rely on their agility, skill, and strength for protection. For long-range combat, bows and arrows were the preferred weapons. Simple bows came in various sizes, smaller ones for close-range skirmishes and longer versions for stationary formations of archers. Composite bows, introduced during the early New Kingdom, delivered greater penetration and were often reserved for officers. Archers selected different types of arrowheads based on the intended effect. Other ranged weapons included slings, spears, and javelins. In close combat, soldiers wielded clubs and fighting rods. Battle axes were ideal for hacking through enemy ranks, while scimitars allowed for powerful slashing attacks. The short dagger, used as a last resort, was also employed for a more grisly task. After battle, Egyptian soldiers tallied the dead by severing a hand from each fallen enemy. In one scene from the late 18th dynasty, triumphant Egyptian soldiers are shown departing the battlefield with 3 severed hands skewered on each of their spears. While the infantry formed the backbone of Egypt's military, the chariotry served as its elite strike force. The arrival of horses and chariots from Western Asia at the dawn of the New Kingdom revolutionized ancient warfare, providing Egypt with a highly effective weapon against large formations of enemy infantry. Each chariot was crewed by 2 men, a warrior armed with a bow and arrows, and a driver who also served as a shield-bearer. The chariot's light frame and rear-mounted wheels allowed for maximum speed and agility, making it ideal for breaking up enemy formations ahead of a main assault and for pursuing retreating foes to transform a withdrawal into a rout. This cutting-edge technology was not only a formidable weapon, but also a potent status symbol for Egypt's elite. Nevertheless, the 18th dynasty Egyptians turned this foreign invention into an instrument of conquest, using their chariot corps to subjugate province after province throughout the Near East. Without the chariot, Egypt's imperial ambitions might never have been realized. On campaign, chariots were privileges reserved for the officer class. For ordinary soldiers to enjoy such luxuries, they had to start at the lowest ranks and steadily climb the military hierarchy. The army offered determined and ambitious men a pathway to prestige and power. Few exemplify this better than Horemheb. Coming from a provincial background in Middle Egypt, his military career propelled him not only to the highest ranks of the army, but ultimately to the summit of the Egyptian state itself. Born during the reign of Amenhotep III, Horemheb's early years under Akhenaten remain obscure. However, subtle clues suggest that his talents were recognized early on, earning him advancement to senior positions. In the cliffs of Akhetaten, an unfinished tomb bears inscriptions for a king scribe and general named Patanemub. Since it was common for ambitious individuals to change their names during Akhenaten's reign to reflect the royal religion and eliminate references to older deities, it is quite plausible that Patanemub, the Aten's infestival, and Horemheb, Horus's infestival, were the same person. Horemheb may have adopted the name Patanemub during Akhenaten's rule. only to revert to his original name after Akhenaten's death. By the time Tutankhamun ascended the throne in 1332, Horemheb had risen to become commander-in-chief of the young pharaoh's army, a general of generals. Horemheb's grand private tomb at Saqqara is adorned with rich scenes depicting his role as supreme overseer of the army. Illustrated within are images of life inside a military camp, where messenger boys are shown running swiftly between tents, carrying orders from one officer to another. In other scenes, Horemheb receives desperate emissaries from famine-stricken foreign lands, who beg for mercy, throwing themselves to the ground in repeated acts of submission, prostrating 7 times on the belly and 7 times on the back. More disturbing are the depictions of prisoners of war from Horemheb's campaigns in the Near East and Nubia. Captives stand in long rows before the commander-in-chief, awaiting their fate. Asiatic prisoners, restrained with wooden manacles and ropes around their necks, are paraded before Egyptian soldiers, who push and herd them into position. As part of standard military policy, entire families were taken from their homelands and brought to Egypt as hostages, serving as leverage to ensure the compliance of their countrymen. Even more degrading treatment was reserved for the Nubian inhabitants of Kush, Egypt's most frequent adversary. The Kushite leader is shown groveling before Horemheb, while his men are harassed and humiliated by Egyptian soldiers, who beat them with sticks and strike them in the face. Throughout these scenes, army scribes meticulously document every detail with characteristic military precision. This display of merciless authority won Horemheb favor beyond the military ranks. In pharaonic Egypt, such qualities also opened doors to the highest levels of government. Like many top officers, Horemheb successfully combined military leadership with a prominent role in civil administration. While commanding Tutankhamun's army, he also served as the young pharaoh's protector, as the king's deputy over the entire land, and the one who conveys the king's words to his court. Horemheb wielded tremendous influence over state affairs. Operating from his seat in Memphis, he likely played a key role in steering the country back toward religious orthodoxy. The inscriptions in his tomb conspicuously omit any mention of Tutankhamun's name. As the power behind the throne, the commander-in-chief was already guiding the nation toward military rule as a means to restore stability. His many titles reflected this authority, declaring him the 2 eyes of the king in leading the 2 lands and establishing the laws of the 2 banks. It would not be long before Horemheb completed his rise, transitioning from royal deputy to assume the highest office as king himself. At the time of Tutankhamun's sudden death in 1322, Horemheb was far away on campaign in Syria, leading Egyptian forces in an unsuccessful attempt to retake the rebellious city of Kadesh and wrest it from Hittite control. The details of his involvement in the shadowy events that followed remain unclear. Perhaps Horemheb preferred it that way. Even if Ice's unexpected ascension temporarily blocked his path, Horemheb knew that Ice's advanced age meant his reign would not last long. After years spent carefully building his power base and waiting patiently, Horemheb could afford to bide his time a little longer before claiming the throne. When he finally ascended as ruler of the 2 lands, following Ice's short 4-year reign, 1322 to 1319, Horemheb's rise may have seemed inevitable. He had already been named Tutankhamun's successor and was simply fulfilling what the royal narrative would later present as his rightful destiny. This was surely the version promoted by the palace propagandists. In truth, however, a commoner with no royal lineage taking the throne marked a radical departure from tradition, posing a threat to the very principle of hereditary kingship. In effect, Horemheb's rise to power was nothing short of a military coup. But as a shrewd strategist, he fully recognized the risks and understood that securing his rule would require not only legitimizing his kingship, but also redefining the monarchy itself. Even with the army's backing, establishing a new order for Egypt would demand all of his political skill. His first priority, as always, was to secure divine endorsement for his reign. Horemheb achieved this brilliantly by timing his coronation to coincide with the annual Opet festival in Thebes. Emerging from the sanctuary of Luxor Temple, newly crowned and imbued with divine power through communion with Amuniasare, he presented himself as the chosen ruler. In such a setting, who could dare question his right to the throne? Once firmly seated on the throne of Horus, Horemheb tasked his priests and scribes with crafting a convincing narrative to explain how a military commander had come to rule Egypt. The result was a masterful piece of religious and political fiction. The official story claimed that from childhood, Horemheb had been divinely chosen and protected by his local deity, Horus of Heracleopolis, who acted as his father and guardian, preserving him until the destined moment arrived. A generation and another passed by, while his father kept him safe, knowing the day would come when he would retire and hand over the kingship to him. According to this account, Horemheb's long service in both the military and civil administration was all part of a divine plan. When the appointed time arrived, Horus elevated his chosen servant and entrusted him to the protection of Amuniasare. In this way, a provincial youth rose to become ruler of the two lands. Both the timing and location of Horemheb's coronation deliberately evoked the splendor of Amenhotep III's reign. This was no accident. A central part of Horemheb's strategy for legitimizing his rule involved erasing the reigns that had followed Amenhotep III, allowing him to present himself as the first legitimate pharaoh since Egypt's dazzling orb. To achieve this, Akhenaten's temples at Gimpitan were systematically dismantled, with their stones reused in Horemheb's own building projects. Work crews were dispatched to Akhetaten to eliminate all traces of the heretic king. Statues of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were torn down, shattered, and discarded outside the great Aten temple. Tutankhamun and I were also targeted for official condemnation. The boy king's inscriptions and monuments were reinscribed with Horemheb's name and titles, enabling him to claim sole credit for the restoration of orthodoxy. I, the elderly courtier who had once blocked Horemheb's ascent, received even harsher treatment. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings and his public monuments were defaced to ensure his memory would vanish, denying him any hope of an afterlife. In the end, after a lifetime of rivalry, Horemheb emerged victorious, restoring the temples, reinstating their offerings, and replenishing their priesthoods were all crucial steps in steering Egypt back to its traditional course. But Horemheb's counter-revolution extended beyond religion. As was customary for Egyptian rulers, he announced his governing philosophy through the Horus name he adopted at his accession, Mighty Bull, whose counsels are penetrating. The emphasis on law and order was intentional. Building upon his earlier role in establishing the laws of the two banks under Tutankhamun, Horemheb now issued a sweeping series of legal reforms, formalized through an edict. One of the most comprehensive surviving examples of pharaonic legislation, the decree sought both to curb abuses of power by government officials and to strengthen the stability of Horemheb's regime. While the preamble employed the familiar lofty rhetoric, the measures that followed were entirely practical. They reflect a ruler deeply rooted in military discipline, intent on governing Egypt with similar rigor. For out of the 10 edict clauses established strict penalties for the misuse of authority by palace agents. Anyone caught seizing boats or workers assigned to state projects faced severe punishment. Exile to the remote border fortress of Tjaru and facial disfigurement. Government officials caught embezzling would lose their noses. Corrupt palace staff were not spared. Fraudulent tax assessments, excessive demand for fodder that impoverished the people, or extortion of local mayors during royal tours were all outlawed. Even the military was held to these strict standards. Any soldier caught stealing hides to supplement his equipment would be subjected to brutal penalties: 100 lashes, 5 open wounds, and the confiscation of the stolen goods. After addressing official corruption, Horemheb turned his legislative focus to reforming the legal system. Cleansing the judiciary has long been a favored tactic of authoritarian rulers, particularly those with military backgrounds, and Horemheb followed this familiar path. He appointed a host of new judges, individuals expected to be attentive to the words of the court and the laws of the judgment hall. To further reinforce judicial integrity, he decreed that any local official found guilty of obstructing justice would face execution. As he proclaimed, "My Majesty has done this to strengthen the laws of Egypt." In his reign, the king's word was absolute law. The final set of measures in Horemheb's edict perhaps reveal his priorities most clearly, as they focused on his own security. One provision imposed new restrictions on the movements and activities of the royal harem staff. The 10th and final clause was even more forthright, granting additional rewards to members of the king's personal bodyguard. It will be as if every day were a festival for them, each man seated and receiving his share of every good thing, praise for his service, with gifts cast to them from the window, and each man called by name. From then on, the royal bodyguards would enjoy extra benefits from the king's personal wealth on top of their standard rations provided by the state treasury. In return, a new protocol was instituted within the inner palace, ensuring strict control over who could access the royal chambers and making certain everyone knew and observed their proper place. Horemheb was determined to leave nothing to chance when it came to his own safety. Having risen to power through military strength, he had no intention of falling victim to violence himself. The edict left no doubt. He was a courageous and vigilant ruler. Through these measures, Horemheb succeeded in solidifying his authority and securing the legitimacy of his reign. He brought military discipline to bear on a nation that had been weakened by 3 decades of political instability and uncertainty. Yet one problem remained. He had no heir. Without children to inherit the throne, Horemheb faced the risk that his hard-won reforms could be undone by a contested succession. His solution followed the same model that had led to his own rise. Among his closest confidants, he identified a successor from within the military ranks. Ramesses was a soldier through and through. The son of a battalion commander, he had begun his career as a common soldier, earning an officer's commission, then rising through the ranks to fortress commander, aide-de-camp to the king, and eventually general. He was cut from the same cloth as Horemheb, sharing both a similar background and outlook. Even more advantageous, Ramesses already had a son, and a grandson was on the way. Horemheb carefully prepared Ramesses for succession by appointing him to a series of high civilian offices, naming him king's deputy and vizier. At the same time, he required Ramesses to relinquish his military positions while Horemheb continued to command the army. Transferring control of such a powerful institution, even to a trusted subordinate, would have been unwise. Yet by granting Ramesses the titles of king's son and hereditary prince, Horemheb made his intention to pass on the throne unmistakably clear. As his reign drew to a close, Ramesses adopted the name Ramesses beloved of Ammonius and began inscribing his name within a royal cartouche. The transition to the Ramesside dynasty had begun. Although Horemheb paved the way for the new dynasty, its first ruler viewed himself as the true founder. To emphasize this new beginning, Ramesses, now known as Ramesses I, deliberately chose a throne name reminiscent of Ahmose, founder of the 18th dynasty. While Ahmose's name meant Ra is Lord of Strength, Ramesses adopted the name Menpethera, meaning Ra is enduring in strength. Yet his reign would prove short-lived. Already an elderly man at his accession, Ramesses I entrusted much of the kingdom's administration to his son Seti. This proved a wise choice. Just 18 months after taking the throne, Ramesses I died. His successor, Seti I, was a vigorous, energetic ruler, tall, athletic, and distinguished in appearance, with high cheekbones and the prominent aquiline nose that became characteristic of the Ramesside line. Thanks to Horemheb's legal reforms, royal authority was firmly re-established and corruption rooted out, allowing Seti to focus on restoring Egypt's strength and prestige both domestically and abroad. Prosperity and stability had long been demonstrated through grand state construction projects, and for the next 10 years, the land resounded with the sounds of masons' chisels and the calls of laborers as Seti I launched an ambitious series of new monuments at important sites across Egypt. Not since the reign of Amenhotep III had government architects and artists been so fully employed. Seti's most ambitious endeavor was a magnificent temple at Abydos, the ancient cradle of kingship and the sacred center of the Osiris cult. The temple's design introduced a bold new architectural plan and a strikingly inclusive dedication. Behind a columned hall, itself fronted by two grand courtyards, lay not a single sanctuary but 7, each devoted to one of Egypt's chief deities, the divine family of Horus, Isis, and Osiris, the solar gods Amenhotep and Urahorti, patron of Memphis and craftsman, and finally, as might be expected, Seti himself. Additional chambers were set aside for the Memphite funerary gods Nefertiti and Ta-Sokher, ensuring their inclusion. By bringing Egypt's foremost gods together under one roof to honor him, Seti sought to reinforce the theological authority of the new Ramesside dynasty. The theme of dynastic legitimacy was emphasized further in a long corridor leading southward from the column hall. Exquisite reliefs there depicted Seti's eldest son, Prince Ramesses, reading from a papyrus scroll listing 67 royal ancestors, stretching back to Menes, the legendary founder of Egypt. This Abydos king list, drawn from ancient temple archives, serve a religious rather than purely historical purpose. Its aim was to emphasize an unbroken succession of legitimate kings from the first dynasty to Seti I and his son, while deliberately omitting rulers deemed unworthy. The Hyksos, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and his 3 immediate successors were all excluded. In the religious context of royal ancestor worship, such tainted predecessors were best forgotten. Abydos became the spiritual center of Seti's rule, and he spared no effort in ensuring its eternal operation. First, he endowed the temple with extensive lands and resources, many located deep within conquered Nubia, where no local objections could arise. He also issued a sweeping decree, following Horemheb's precedent, to shield these resources from misuse by other state institutions. This directive, known as the Nori Decree, was carved into the side of a sandstone hill near the Third Nile Cataract beside a fortified outpost. It laid out the punishment for any fortress official, scribe, or agent who interfered with the annual shipments of produce from Kush to the temple. 100 lashes and a heavy fine. With these regular shipments of goods secured for the temple's treasury, Seti also turned his attention to ensuring a steady flow of gold, the ultimate symbol of wealth. He ordered the reopening of gold mines in Egypt's distant eastern desert and personally oversaw the mining operations and the transport of precious ore back to the Nile Valley. An inscription at a remote temple in the Wadi Bermia recounts his personal involvement, describing how the king surveyed the mountains and, finding the dry, waterless route a hardship for his workers, ordered wells to be dug in the mountains to relieve their thirst and restore their spirits under the scorching sun. Seti's innovative approach extended even to the preparation of his final resting place. This tomb became the longest and deepest ever constructed at Thebes and was the first to feature decoration on every surface. Walls, ceilings, and chambers were entirely adorned with exquisite paintings and carvings. This comprehensive decorative scheme set the standard for all subsequent royal tombs of the New Kingdom. Among its many wonders, one masterpiece stands out: the vaulted ceiling of the burial chamber, painted with astronomical motifs to resemble the heavens themselves. Though the Ramesside dynasty was still young, less than a decade old, Seti I harbored no doubts about the eternal nature of his legacy. Restoring sacred sites to their former glory and adorning them with impressive new monuments had long been a reliable method for boosting Egypt's domestic prestige. However, the challenge of enhancing the nation's standing on the international stage remained. With his military background, Seti understood that global influence was rooted in military might. Yet Egypt had not secured a major victory in the Near East since the days of Amenhotep II. During the reigns of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, attempts to defend or expand Egypt's territories in Syria had failed miserably. Horemheb had made efforts to re-establish Egyptian dominance, but with limited success. As a result, Egypt's reputation as a great power was severely weakened. Its foreign holdings were at risk of breaking away or being seized by the Hittites, and its control over vital trade routes was under threat. Swift action was necessary to protect the Ramesside legacy from slipping away. Wasting no time, Seti launched his first military campaign while still crown prince. Advancing along the Phoenician coast, he worked to reclaim Egypt's historical sphere of influence and to ensure continued access to Mediterranean ports, along with their garrisons and bustling trade centers. At the beginning of his sole reign in 1290, he led further expeditions with similar strategic goals. The first to suffer Egypt's military might were the Bedouin tribes of northern Sinai. Although conflicts among these tribes did not directly endanger Egyptian security, they jeopardized critical supply routes to Egypt's imperial possessions in Syria-Palestine. Seti understood that maintaining control over the coastal route in northern Sinai was essential for any broader military ambitions. Once Egypt's authority was reasserted at home, Seti pushed forward into Canaan, regaining key fortified cities such as Beth-Shan and Yinom. His victory was symbolically sealed when he compelled the chiefs of Lebanon to cut wood before him. In earlier eras, such localized campaigns would not have required the king's personal leadership. But Seti recognized the importance of projecting a renewed image of royal power abroad, and he was well suited for battle. However, maintaining this aggressive policy would draw Egypt deeper into the complex web of international politics, bringing far-reaching consequences. By Seti's time, the political landscape of the Near East had undergone dramatic and irreversible changes since the confident days of the late 18th dynasty. Under Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III, Egypt had established lasting peace with the northern Mesopotamian kingdom of Mitanni, cemented through a series of diplomatic marriages. For 50 years, the two powers had respected each other's spheres of influence and coexisted peacefully. But early in Akhenaten's reign, the rise of an aggressive and ambitious Hittite king shattered this carefully crafted balance. In a series of rapid and devastating campaigns, Shupaluyama, the Hittite ruler, broke out from Anatolia, seized large portions of Mitanni territory, and even plundered its capital. Egypt remained loyal to its ally, but by then, Mitanni was a declining power. A new superpower had emerged, and Egypt was caught completely off guard. During Akhenaten's reign, the initial response of the Egyptian government was to stay uninvolved. This policy of inaction proved to be a grave miscalculation. The combined weakness of Mitanni and Egypt's reluctance to intervene allowed several former vassal states to exploit the resulting power vacuum and seek greater independence. Among these, Amurru was especially prominent. Its ruler, Abu Simbel, was an opportunistic manipulator, quick to exploit political rivalries and social unrest to serve his own ambitions. His numerous letters to the Egyptian court form a significant part of the Amarna letters. Whether the Egyptians failed to fully understand his intentions or deliberately chose a policy of non-intervention remains uncertain. Regardless, this disinterest only emboldened Abu Simbel, and Amurru slipped from Egyptian control. Elsewhere, Egypt's once feared authority fared no better with the rebellious state of Kadesh. The rulers of Kadesh had posed a persistent challenge to Egypt since the days of Thutmose III, and during Akhenaten's rule, they promptly defected to the Hittites when their forces approached. A failed attempt to retake Kadesh exposed Egypt's diminishing power. Another assault during Tutankhamun's reign met the same fate, encouraging the Hittites to further strengthen their grip on northern Syria. Aziru of Amurru, Abu Simbel's son, recognizing the shifting balance of power, aligned himself with Kadesh and pledged loyalty to the rising Hittite empire. In a desperate bid to avoid domination by the Egyptian regent I, Tutankhamun's widow proposed a marriage alliance with a Hittite prince, potentially opening the door to a lasting peace. However, the mysterious death of Prince Zenanza only gave the Hittite king fresh justification for military aggression, as he retaliated by attacking Egyptian-held territories in southern Syria. Yet, fortune did not favor the Hittites completely. The prisoners taken during these punitive campaigns unknowingly carried a deadly plague back to the Hittite capital. The epidemic swept through Hattusa, claiming the lives of the king and his crown prince. The plague continued to ravage the Hittite heartland for 2 decades. To the Hittites, it must have seemed as though the gods had turned against them. To the Egyptians, these strange events far from home rekindled hopes of victory. A tense, fragile peace descended upon Syria, with Egypt and the Hittites locked in a stalemate. Such was the situation when Seti I ascended the throne. A soldier at heart, Seti was determined to restore Egypt's lost prestige. After 50 years of humiliating retreat, it was time for Ammonius RA to lead his people forward once more. Having reasserted Egyptian authority over Phoenicia and Canaan, Seti turned his focus to Amurru and Kadesh. Reclaiming these territories would deal a symbolic blow to Hittite ambitions and greatly enhance Egypt's standing in the region. Only a year after securing Bethshan and Yinom, Seti's forces advanced deep into central Syria. Kadesh fell, and the victorious pharaoh commemorated his success with a grand inscription in the city. But the triumph was fleeting. No sooner had the Egyptian army departed than the treacherous inhabitants of Kadesh returned to Hittite allegiance. In contrast, Seti's campaign in Amurru achieved lasting results. Once brought back under Egyptian control, Amurru remained loyal. By the end of the campaign, a significant part of central Syria had switched allegiance. Seti had wiped away the shame of earlier defeats and set Egypt once again on the road to imperial dominance. In reality, the Hittites were far from defeated. They regrouped, rallying their formidable forces on the Anatolian plateau, preparing for full-scale war. As tensions mounted, the long-anticipated confrontation between the two great powers was drawing ever closer. Beneath the apparent determination and confidence of Seti I's foreign policy lies a troubling paradox. If, as later accounts suggest, Egypt and the Hittites had reached some form of understanding during Horemheb's reign, then Seti's daring military campaigns completely disregarded that arrangement. His actions ignited a chain of increasingly violent confrontations that ultimately failed to restore Egypt's dominance, instead leading to long-term setbacks. In hindsight, Seti's military ventures in Asia appear reckless and misguided. One possible reason for this course of action may have been political convenience, rather than a carefully thought-out assessment of Egypt's true strategic needs. Throughout history, rulers have often provoked foreign conflicts to divert attention from domestic troubles. Indeed, certain clues from the early years of Seti's reign suggest possible instability within his own administration. Notably, on the battle reliefs at Ipitsut, an enigmatic figure identified simply as the group marshal and fan-bearer Mehi appears with unusual prominence, suggesting a significant role in both the military campaigns and Seti's broader offensive agenda. For Mehi to be depicted with such distinction on a royal monument, he must have been one of the most powerful figures at court. Some have even proposed that Mehi was designated as Seti's successor, following the precedent of military officers rising to the throne. However, Seti's young son, Prince Ramesses, had other plans. Within a few short years of Mehi's depiction being carved, every image of him was systematically removed from the Ipitsut reliefs, replaced by images of Ramesses himself. The next generation of the Ramesside dynasty was determined not to allow a commoner to wield such influence over Egypt's affairs. Only Ramesses would be remembered by history as his father's true heir and most loyal supporter. Only Ramesses would continue Seti's ambitious foreign policy and lead Egypt toward imperial glory. Only Ramesses would directly confront the Hittites in a decisive battle for supremacy on the world stage. With the pharaoh's army preparing for war, the nation marched resolutely toward its next great conflict. On a crisp May morning in 1274, shortly after sunrise, Ramesses II broke camp and led his army forward. In the cool morning air, the immense force of more than 20,000 men slowly descended from their ridgetop campsite, winding their way down the dusty trail into the valley below. After a month-long march, their final destination lay just a few hours ahead. For centuries, The city of Kadesh had been a major player in Near Eastern power struggles. Located in the fertile Orontes River Valley, it controlled one of the few strategic passes connecting inland Syria to the Mediterranean coast. Its position made it a critical prize for any power-seeking dominance over the region. In Thutmose III's time, Kadesh's prince had led the rebels defeated at Megiddo. More recently, Kadesh had adeptly played both Egypt and the Hittites against each other, shifting alliances whenever it served their interests. Its rulers had also taken extensive precautions to fortify their city. While they were willing to incite conflict between the rival empires, they had no intention of seeing their city destroyed in the process. Nestled at the junction of the Orontes and one of its tributaries, Kadesh was naturally protected on three sides by water. By digging a channel to connect the two rivers on the southern side, they had effectively transformed the heavily fortified city into an island fortress, virtually impervious to attack. Nevertheless, Ramesses was determined to capture Kadesh and restore Egypt's prestige in Syria. After a decade of sporadic conflict, both the Egyptians and Hittites agreed that Kadesh would serve as the stage for a decisive battle to determine control over Amurru. With determination and anticipation, the Egyptian army advanced toward its objective. Ramesses had assembled a massive force, likely representing three-quarters of Egypt's military strength. Organized into 4 divisions, each led by a senior royal officer, the king personally commanded the lead division, named after the god Ammonius. Following behind were the divisions of Ra, Ta, and Seth. Once on the move, the long line of soldiers stretched for more than a mile, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. As the son and heir of the warrior king Seti I, Ramesses had learned the art of leadership firsthand. The sight of him riding triumphantly in his golden chariot inspired his troops and struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Early reports from the field suggested that the Hittites had been intimidated. As the division of Ammonius advanced through dense woods on the southern bank of the Orontes, Egyptian scouts captured 2 Bedouin tribesmen. Under questioning, they delivered astonishing news. The Hittite army, overwhelmed by Ramesses' strength, was retreating and currently camped 120 miles away in Aleppo. Suspicious of possible deceit, the Egyptians interrogated the captives further, but the Bedouins maintained their story. Encouraged by these reports, the Egyptian army confidently pressed on toward Kadesh. Emerging from the forest, the division of Ammonius crossed the Orontes near the village of Shabtuna. After another 3 hours of marching, they reached their campsite opposite Kadesh. The location was ideal, with a nearby stream offering much-needed water for both men and horses. While the animals drank, the soldiers quickly set up camp, parking chariots, erecting tents, and positioning shields into a protective formation. By 3 p.m., the sprawling fortress of Kadesh loomed faintly on the southeastern horizon. Upon arrival, Ramesses' scouts immediately fanned out to survey the surroundings and gather intelligence on enemy movements. They soon encountered 2 Hittite spies conducting similar reconnaissance. Fortune favored the Egyptians once again that afternoon. The captured spies were subjected not to gentle questioning, but to severe beatings. Under torture, they revealed shocking information. The Hittite king Muwatalli II and his forces were not far away, but camped directly behind Kadesh, hidden from view by the town's mound. Moreover, the Hittite army was not retreating, but preparing to launch a surprise attack on the Egyptians at any moment. After revealing their shocking information, the captured spies were brought before a stunned Ramesses. Overcome with rage, the pharaoh lashed out at his senior officers for their incompetence. Taking full control of the unfolding crisis, he issued immediate emergency orders. The royal princes who had accompanied him were quickly evacuated westward, away from the impending assault. The vizier was dispatched south at full speed to hasten the advance of the division of Ta, which was still preparing to cross the Orontes. Ramesses' desperate message was clear: His Majesty is all alone. Moments later, the Hittite attack began. A formidable force of 2,500 chariots, manned by warriors clad in long mail coats, surged across the river and struck the division of Ra as it advanced north toward the Egyptian camp. Unlike the Egyptian chariots, designed as swift mobile platforms for archers, the Hittite chariots were solid and heavily armed, built for shock combat. Each carried a crew of 3 armed with spears for close-quarters fighting. When deployed en masse, these chariots were devastating against enemy infantry, as the division of Ra quickly learned to its great cost. The battlefield was soon littered with Egyptian dead and wounded. The survivors, panicked and disorganized, fled toward their camp with the Hittites close behind. The enemy quickly reached the Egyptian camp, breaking through the still unfinished shield wall and charging directly into the command tents. Chaos erupted. With no time for deliberation, Ramesses sprang into action, leaping onto his chariot and throwing himself into battle against the attackers. At his side stood his elite bodyguard of Aegean mercenaries, fierce warriors from the western fringes of the Hittite world whose bravery had earned them reputations as formidable soldiers for hire throughout the Near East. These men, not the Nubians of earlier times, were now the preferred foreign recruits of Egypt's army. Together, they fought fiercely as Ramesses maneuvered his chariot through the turmoil, unleashing a hail of arrows at the enemy while maintaining the defense amid the mayhem. Despite their efforts, the situation appeared dire, and it seemed only a miracle could save them. That miracle arrived, though it was not divine intervention, but a result of careful planning. While the main Egyptian force had marched overland to Kadesh, a reserve unit of elite troops had been dispatched by sea, sailing along the Phoenician coast. Their mission was to land at the port of Sumer and march inland via the Eleutheris Valley, modern Nahr el-Kabir, to rendezvous with Ramesses at Kadesh on the day of his arrival. The plan worked flawlessly. Just as the battle reached its critical moment, the reinforcements appeared on the horizon in a cloud of dust. Reinvigorated by the arrival of these elite charioteers, the Egyptians regrouped and launched a counterattack. The Hittites were pushed back, forcing a retreat toward the Orontes. As the enemy fell into the river, many drowned or were swept away by the current, while others narrowly escaped to the opposite bank. The Prince of Aleppo, one of Muwatalli's leading commanders, was dragged from the bloody waters by his men, barely clinging to life. What had begun as a surprise assault by the Hittites had now backfired. In a matter of minutes, what seemed to be a certain victory for Muwatalli had turned into a humiliating defeat. As evening fell, the Egyptian division of Ta finally arrived, just in time to capture the remaining Hittite soldiers, count the enemy dead, and gather the spoils abandoned on the battlefield. The surviving Egyptian troops staggered back to their camp, soon followed by the 4th and final division, Seth. Both sides now paused to assess the toll of the fierce engagement. For Egypt, the heavy casualties on the battlefield were compounded by a serious blow to its military reputation. The army had come perilously close to destruction, and it was only the king's personal courage, combined with the timely arrival of reinforcements, that had averted total disaster. The Hittites, too, faced a grim aftermath. King Muwatalli had lost 2 of his own brothers in the fighting, along with his secretary, the chief of his personal guard, for elite charioteers and many officers. With neither side achieving a clear victory, the Battle of Kadesh remained unresolved. At dawn, after a restless night spent treating the wounded and repairing damaged chariots, the 2 armies faced each other again on the plain outside Kadesh, prepared for the long-anticipated battle. But the previous day's bloodshed had left both forces critically weakened. The Egyptians, having lost many men, could not overcome the fresh and determined Hittite infantry, which had remained unengaged during the initial assault. The Hittites, meanwhile, had lost much of their chariot force and were unable to deliver a decisive blow. After hours of brutal combat with no breakthrough, Ramesses finally ordered his troops to retreat from the field. He recognized that capturing Kadesh was no longer possible. Muwatalli, likewise, saw that victory was out of reach. He offered terms for peace and sent an envoy to the Egyptian camp to negotiate a ceasefire. Ramesses, with little choice, agreed. Just 24 hours after arriving at Kadesh, the Egyptians gathered their equipment and began their march home. After 2 long months away, Ramesses' once mighty army returned to the Nile Delta in late June, weary and demoralized. Yet Ramesses himself seemed to draw confidence from the hard-fought encounter, particularly from his own actions that had spared Egypt from disaster. Though he had not secured a decisive victory, he had salvaged survival from near defeat, reinforcing his belief in his destiny. True to his grandiose nature, Ramesses transformed the Kadesh campaign into a personal triumph. Through a well-coordinated propaganda effort combining literature and visual art, the pharaoh spread his version of events throughout Egypt. Court writers were commissioned to produce both a factual prose account and a stirring epic poem celebrating the king's great victory over the Hittites. These texts were carved into temple walls and undoubtedly performed repeatedly at court to reinforce the message. To accompany these literary works, Ramesses ordered his artists to create a standardized series of dramatic battle scenes. Central to these images was the king himself, depicted heroically defending the camp single-handedly against waves of attackers. So pleased was Ramesses with these portrayals that he had the same set of scenes engraved on the facades of at least 5 major temples. Together, the poems and images not only glorified his bravery, but also highlighted the failings of his senior commanders, contrasting their hesitation with his own decisiveness under fire. For a king whose throne may once have been threatened by rivals within the military elite, this was a deeply satisfying form of vindication. For modern historians, these extensive texts and images provide an unparalleled wealth of information, making the Battle of Kadesh the best documented military engagement of the ancient world. For Ramesses' contemporaries, however, these grandiose accounts signal the dramatic return to the ostentatious and boastful monarchy of earlier times. After the heresy of Akhenaten, the brief reigns of his immediate successors, and the military rule of Horemheb and the early Ramesside kings, a flamboyant and triumphant kingship had returned in full force. Although the stalemate at Kadesh failed to achieve Ramesses II's strategic ambitions, the truce that followed offered him an unexpected benefit: the opportunity to channel resources away from costly foreign campaigns and into grand domestic projects. During the first 20 years of his reign, Ramesses embarked on an ambitious program of temple construction that spanned his empire, from the Lebanese port of Kebni in the north to Gebel Barkal Deep in Sudan. His particular focus on Nubia was evident, as he commissioned shrines at 7 different sites in the region under Egyptian control. Within Egypt itself, his architects and builders undertook major expansions of the great national temples at Heracleopolis, Abydos, and Thebes. Today, no other pharaoh has left behind as many surviving monuments bearing their name as Ramesses II. Through both new constructions and the deliberate appropriation of earlier structures, Ramesses guaranteed his legacy would endure for eternity. His drive appeared fueled by an intense desire to surpass all who came before him, coupled with an unwavering belief in his own singular importance. One of his favorite personal myths recounted how the 7 Hathors had gathered around his cradle as an infant, foretelling an extraordinary destiny for him from birth. Whether this reveals extreme self-absorption or an underlying insecurity remains a matter of speculation. What is certain is that his building projects prioritize scale and power over subtlety or grace. Only in the richly decorated tomb he commissioned for his beloved queen, Nefertiti, at Thebes, did he allow his craftsmen the freedom to fully express their artistic talents. Even Egypt's impressive quarries struggled to meet the enormous demand for stone required by his simultaneous construction efforts. As a solution, Ramesses resorted to dismantling the monuments of earlier rulers and repurposing their materials for his own projects. Among the most significant casualties of this plundering were the temples erected by Akhenaten at Thebes and Akhetaten. The small, uniform stone blocks that had allowed Akhenaten to build so quickly also made his monuments easy to dismantle. Thousands of these blocks were stripped from the Aten temples to build new shrines honoring Egypt's traditional gods. In this way, Ramesses simultaneously purged the remnants of Akhenaten's religious revolution and promoted himself as the guardian of the old faith. Since the reign of Amenhotep III, nearly a century earlier, Luxor Temple had been the ceremonial heart of divine kingship, its grand colonnade hall and elegant courtyard providing a majestic setting for the annual Opet festival. Ramesses could not resist the chance to enhance it further. He added a new forecourt and an enormous gateway, which he decorated with monumental reliefs celebrating his so-called victory at Kadesh. Unafraid to modify the work of his predecessors, he even altered the temple's main axis to better align it with Ipit-Sut, creating a more unified processional path. To complete the redesigned facade, Ramesses installed what became his signature feature: colossal seated statues of himself, accompanied by towering obelisks. In the end, grandeur and spectacle seemed to be his ultimate goals. Nowhere is Ramesses's flair for spectacle and self-glorification more vividly displayed than at the temple of Ramesses' beloved Ammonius, known today as Abu Simbel in Lower Nubia. The sheer rock face of a sacred mountain rising above the Nile near the Second Cataract served as the setting for his most extraordinary and audacious creation. The smaller of the two temples was dedicated to Hathor, the mother goddess and protector of royalty. Inside, a relief shows the goddess emerging from the primordial papyrus marshes, cradling the king in her embrace. Outside, however, piety gives way to ostentation, with the decoration focusing on Queen Nefertiti and her devoted husband. Flanking the temple entrance are statues of Nefertiti, each accompanied by towering 30-foot figures of Ramesses himself. The larger temple elevates this theme further, dominated both inside and out by the king's likeness. Its facade features 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses, each nearly 70 feet tall. Beneath them, rows of foreign captives are carved beneath the king's name, symbolizing his domination over all peoples. Inside, the walls depict Ramesses slaughtering Egypt's enemies and presenting them to the gods. At Abu Simbel, far from the heart of Egypt, Ramesses's self-deification reaches its zenith, unchecked by tradition or restraint. The full extent of his self-aggrandizement becomes clearest in the temple's innermost sanctuary. Beyond a grand pillared hall and past numerous depictions of the Battle of Kadesh, lies the sacred chamber carved into the heart of the mountain. Here sit statues of Egypt's 4 chief gods: Ptah of Memphis, Ammonius of Thebes, Amenhotep the solar deity, and the deified Ramesses himself, placed among them as an equal. Twice a year, on February 21st and November 21st, the rising sun pierces the temple entrance, illuminating the sanctuary and bathing the divine statues in light. The spectacle must have been awe-inspiring. Following Abu Simbel, Ipit-Sut, and Luxor, Ramesses's most ambitious construction was his mortuary temple at Thebes on the Nile's west bank. Known as Ramesses United with Thebes, or the Ramesseum, it was the most monumental complex of its kind since Amenhotep III. Every part of the temple was devoted to glorifying the king through inscriptions, statues, and reliefs. After passing through the massive gateway, adorned with scenes from Kadesh, visitors entered the first courtyard lined with colossal statues of Ramesses along its northern side. Opposite them stood a balcony from which the king could address his subjects during festivals and public ceremonies. Beyond a second gateway, also carved with battle scenes, lay a second courtyard, again dominated by enormous statues of the king. Beside this gateway, once stood a massive granite colossus. The broken fragments still bear the king's throne name, Usermatra, which later inspired the name Ozymandias, immortalized in the famous poem about the transience of power. The Ramesseum, perhaps more than any of his other projects, reflected Ramesses's unparalleled status, not only spiritually, but economically. The surrounding storerooms and granaries could hold 350 boatloads of grain, enough to sustain a city like Thebes for an entire year. In effect, the Ramesseum functioned as Upper Egypt's reserve treasury. The king's control of such immense resources allowed him to pursue his obsession with grand monuments, from the towering statues of Abu Simbel to the vast courts of Thebes. It is fitting that Shelley's famous lines echo Ramesses' legacy. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Not satisfied with constructing temples and appropriating monuments across Egypt, Ramesses II embarked on an even more ambitious architectural enterprise. His father, Seti I, had once built a modest summer palace near the old Hyksos capital of Hutweret, the ancestral home of the Ramesside dynasty. As a young man, Ramesses likely trained for war there. Upon becoming king, he transformed the site into something far grander. Over 20 years of continuous construction, an expansive complex of palaces, halls, government offices, and military barracks emerged, eventually forming a new dynastic capital that rivaled Memphis and Thebes in magnificence. With characteristic boldness, he named it Ramesses. It was a residence worthy of royalty, boasting extensive living quarters and administrative zones packed with palaces, temples, and public buildings. The surrounding region was among Egypt's most fertile, providing fruit, vegetables, wine, and grazing lands for vast herds of cattle. Scribes wrote glowingly of its canals filled with fish, marshes teeming with birds, lush pastures, and overflowing granaries of barley and wheat. The royal district, spanning 4 square miles, was naturally fortified by canals and sandy ridges along the Nile. Court poets extolled the splendor of Ramesses' palaces, describing grand pillared halls adorned with dazzling tilework. Walls, floors, and columns shimmered with colorful designs depicting rivers, gardens, royal symbols, and foreign captives. Even the steps leading up to the throne bore images of vanquished enemies, so the king might trample them with every ascent. Beyond the royal palace, the elite neighborhoods were equally opulent. The wealthiest citizens lived in grand villas with private canals and lush water gardens, creating a scene reminiscent of Venice. At the city's heart stood a massive temple dedicated to the divine trinity of Amenhotep, fronted by 4 colossal statues of Ramesses himself, rivaling the grandeur of Ipit-Sut. The 4 corners of the city were protected symbolically by shrines to other important deities. In the south, a temple to Seth, god of Hutweret. In the north, a sanctuary for Wadjet, the cobra goddess of the Delta. In the west, a temple honoring Ammonius of Thebes, and in the east, a shrine for Astarte, the Syrian goddess of love and war, who had been absorbed into the Egyptian pantheon and assigned the role of protecting the king's chariot horses. Ramesses was a cosmopolitan city, even by New Kingdom standards. In addition to its foreign deity shrines, the city hosted foreign embassies and entire districts for mercenary soldiers from abroad. Merchants from across the eastern Mediterranean crowded its markets and docks. With its close proximity to Palestine, it likely attracted waves of immigrants seeking opportunity. Pithom, Paratum, is identified with modern Tel el-Maskuta, just a day's travel from Ramesses, while Ramses unmistakably refers to this very dynastic capital. It is highly probable that Semitic-speaking laborers were involved in building the city. As for the Exodus itself, Egyptian records are silent, suggesting the biblical account may weave together multiple historical threads. Yet, as we've seen, Ramesses was never one to let facts obstruct his preferred narrative. While court poets celebrated Ramesses as a joyful royal residence, there was a more ominous side to this grand project. One of the largest structures housed a sprawling bronze-smelting factory where hundreds of laborers worked in intense heat, forging weapons for the king's army. High-temperature furnaces, fueled by blast pipes and bellows, produced molten metal that was cast into shields and swords. In these grueling, dangerous workshops, Egypt's military power was forged. Elsewhere, vast stables, training grounds, and workshops serviced the king's elite chariot corps. The royal stables housed at least 460 horses, cared for by teams of grooms and trainers, while nearby arenas allowed for their exercise and equipment maintenance. In truth, Ramesses was as much a military-industrial complex as it was a royal pleasure palace. Its very creation had been driven by rising conflict in the Near East. From this city, Ramesses had departed for the Battle of Kadesh and returned. Despite its grandeur and prosperity, Ramesses stood as a constant reminder of the king's unfinished struggle in Syria-Palestine. Even with the region's most powerful chariot force at his command, Ramesses had not eliminated the Hittite threat. Yet as he brooded in his riverside palace, frustrated by his stalled ambitions, little could he have known that events far beyond Egypt's borders were about to shift in his favor. The inconclusive outcome at Kadesh had led to a decade-long Cold War, with Egypt and the Hittites locked in a tense standoff, neither side able to claim dominance. However, these long-standing rivals were no longer the only contenders for power in the region. Across the Euphrates, Assyria was rising. Less than a year after the Battle of Kadesh, emboldened by the Hittites' failure to secure victory, the Assyrians struck. They attacked Hanagalbat and turned it into their vassal. It was a clear warning that neither the Hittites nor the Egyptians could afford to dismiss. Determined to reaffirm Egypt's influence, Ramesses launched a series of minor campaigns in the Near East. His goals were threefold: to reinforce Egyptian authority over its vassal territories, to quash opportunistic revolts that had erupted in the wake of Kadesh, and to send a clear signal to the Assyrians that Egypt remained a formidable power. Having suppressed insurgents in the hills of Galilee and recaptured the key port city of Akko, Ramesses's confidence swelled. He boldly advanced into Amurru. One by one, city-states succumbed to the pharaoh's advancing forces, and before long, Ramesses controlled the central Orontes Valley, effectively splitting the Hittites' southern territories in two. His audacious move threatened to ignite a full-scale war, but fate intervened. The sudden death of the Hittite king Muwatalli triggered a political crisis. The throne passed to his young son, Prince Urhi-Teshub, who became king. But within the royal family, power struggles brewed. Hattusili, Muwatalli's brother, had ambitions of his own. Soon, the Hittite court fractured into rival factions. After a bitter internal conflict, Hattusili seized the throne, forcing Urhi-Teshub to flee. Observing these events from afar, Ramesses could scarcely believe his fortune. After years of competing with the Hittites for supremacy, fate had unexpectedly delivered him the perfect bargaining chip. As soon as Urhi-Teshub arrived in Egypt, Hattusili demanded his extradition. Ramesses refused, placing his forces in Syria on high alert to deter any potential Hittite retaliation. Yet his instincts told him an attack was unlikely. A new king had risen in Assyria, driven by imperial ambition. Ramesses correctly judged that the Hittites, facing this looming eastern threat, would be too preoccupied to risk another conflict with Egypt. When Assyria invaded Hanagalbat again, erasing it as an independent entity, the Hittites suddenly found themselves even more vulnerable. The Euphrates now stood as their last barrier against the aggressive expansion of Assyria. Confronted with a far greater danger, Hattusili and his kingdom had little choice but to prioritize national security over old rivalries and wounded pride. An alliance with Assyria was out of the question, so Hattusili cautiously reached out to Egypt, testing the possibility of a peaceful resolution with Ramesses. After a year marked by delicate negotiations and extensive diplomatic exchanges, the terms of an agreement were finally settled. Thus, in early December 1259, nearly 15 years after the Battle of Kadesh, a distinguished delegation departed from Hattusa, headed for Ramesses. Accompanying the Hittite envoys was a representative from Carchemish, the Hittite stronghold on the Euphrates, signaling that fostering amicable relations with Egypt had become central to Hittite foreign and security policy. After a month-long journey across the dusty roads of the Near East, the delegation reached the Grand Delta city and was escorted into Ramesses's royal audience chamber. Bowing deeply before the pharaoh, the chief Hittite envoy presented a large silver tablet, inscribed with cuneiform script. This gift from Hattusili contained a replica of the comprehensive treaty that would henceforth bind Egypt and the Hittite kingdom in mutual alliance and friendship. Determined not to be outdone, Ramesses had the Egyptian version of the agreement carved into the walls of Ipit Sud, ensuring an enduring testament to his diplomatic prowess. The document itself, was extraordinary, regardless of which language it was written in. After formally ending hostilities between the two great powers, the treaty declared the establishment of friendly relations. Behold, Hattusili, ruler of the Hittites, enters into a treaty with Usermatra, chosen of Are, the great king of Egypt, beginning this day, so that perfect peace and brotherhood may exist between us forever. He in brotherhood and peace with me, and I in brotherhood and peace with him, for all time. The provisions of the treaty were comprehensive and visionary. It included a mutual non-aggression pact, a defensive alliance, an extradition agreement, with assurances of humane treatment for those returned, an amnesty for refugees, and a crucial clause protecting the royal succession and the rights of each monarchy. With Akhetaten, the deposed Hittite prince, still living under Egyptian protection, this last stipulation was essential for Hattusili, as it secured his rule and the future of his dynasty. It also aligned with Ramesses' own dynastic ambitions, evident in his unprecedented move to elevate many of his sons to prominent positions. In this way, both nations preserved their dignity and each could claim success. Egypt reluctantly relinquished its aspirations to reclaim Amurru, but retained control of its remaining Asiatic territory, UPE, and secured trading rights along the Lebanese and Syrian coasts, extending as far as Ugarit, modern-day Ras Shamra. With the signing of this accord, the Near East experienced a level of peace not witnessed since the days of the Egypt-Mitanni alliance under Amenhotep III. From bitter foes to close allies, Hattusili and Ramesses marked the dramatic shift in their relations through a cordial exchange of letters. Even their wives joined in this diplomatic warmth, with Ramesses' principal queen, Nefertiti, sending lavish gifts of jewelry and fine garments to her counterpart in Hattusa, affectionately calling her sister. The only lingering issue was the continued asylum Egypt granted to Akhetaten, but Hattusili chose not to let this mar the growing friendship between their kingdoms. As relations flourished, discussions soon turned to the prospect of a dynastic marriage. For Hattusili and his equally determined wife Paducapa, offering their daughter in marriage to the powerful pharaoh of Egypt would cement ties between the two royal houses and strengthen their political position. Ramesses, securely established on his throne, was primarily attracted by the immense dowry accompanying the Hittite princess. Already content with his beloved Egyptian queen, he showed little personal interest in the union itself, treating the arrangement more as a political and financial transaction than a romantic alliance. The Hittite princess, regardless of her personal feelings, had no choice but to obey. In the late autumn of 1246, she departed from the fortified palace of Hattusa, accompanied by a large entourage of dignitaries and an enormous caravan loaded with gold, silver, bronze, livestock, slaves, horses, and other riches. The procession traveled slowly, first crossing the rugged Taurus Mountains, then descending into the coastal plains of southern Anatolia. They continued over the Amenhotep Mountains, down into the Aleppo Plain, and followed the Orontes River southward, passing by Kadesh and finally reaching the frontier of Egyptian-controlled lands. At the border, Queen Paducapa bid her daughter farewell for the final time. A messenger was sent ahead to inform the pharaoh, "They have crossed high mountains and dangerous passes to reach your majesty's border." Ramesses promptly dispatched military escorts and court officials to receive the procession and accompany it safely through Canaan. Their final stop before entering Egypt was a purpose-built royal residence along the Sinai coastal road, offering the princess and her retinue a place to rest and recover from their arduous journey. The palace's richly decorated rooms, adorned with colorful floral murals and gold leaf, offered a glimpse of the luxuries that awaited her. In February 1245, after 3 months of travel, the caravan finally arrived in the resplendent city of Ramesses to jubilant celebrations. After receiving the generous dowry, Ramesses bestowed upon his new bride a grand Egyptian name, Methornefra, meaning she sees in Horus the beauty of Are. Without much fanfare, he then assigned her to one of his harem palaces. Several years later, The princess's brother, Crown Prince Hishmishirma, made a state visit to Egypt, spending the winter in the milder climate of the eastern delta. For a prince raised among Hittite stone citadels, the vivid and extravagant architecture of Ramesses must have left a powerful impression. Indeed, when he eventually assumed the Hittite throne, Hishmishirma decorated his kingdom's sanctuaries with monumental religious art on a scale surpassing that of his predecessors. Even a Hittite, it seemed, could not resist Egypt's artistic grandeur. The prince's visit may have been intended as a prelude to an even more significant meeting. A burst of diplomatic correspondence between their capitals discussed the logistics of such an encounter, and Ramesses expressed his desire that he and Hattusili might finally see each other face to face. The friendship between Egypt and the Hittite kingdom had reached unprecedented strength and would endure until the eventual fall of the Hittite Empire. Throughout his lengthy reign of 67 years, Ramesses II remained deeply committed to protecting Egypt's imperial holdings in the Near East and keeping the Hittite threat at bay. Simultaneously, his security forces kept a close watch on emerging danger from a different direction. The semi-nomadic tribes of the Libyan desert, along with their settled relatives along the coast, have been a persistent nuisance since Egypt's earliest dynasties. In the past, a few military campaigns had been sufficient to deter them and prevent significant incursions into the western delta. But circumstances had shifted. Although little is known about Libya's early history and archaeology prior to the arrival of the Phoenicians in the 8th century BC, Egyptian texts indicate that by the Ramesside era, a sophisticated civilization had developed along the North African coastline. Trade connections with the Mycenaeans brought imported goods and prosperity to the Libyan coast. These new resources enriched local leaders, providing them with wealth and influence previously unknown. Years of service as mercenaries in Egypt's army had also taught the Libyans valuable lessons in modern warfare. They adopted chariot warfare and developed considerable expertise in archery. By the latter part of Ramesses II's reign, the Libyan tribal chiefs had amassed both the wealth and military capability to pose a serious challenge to Egyptian power. In response, Ramesses ordered the fortification of Egypt's entire western frontier. His defensive network consisted of a chain of imposing fortresses spaced approximately 50 miles apart along the length of the western delta. Each stronghold was positioned within a day's chariot ride of its neighbors, and only a few days' ride from Ramesses itself. These fortresses not only guarded the coastal approaches, but also secured the region's key wells, cutting off access to water for any invading force. One of the larger fortifications even housed its own temple, intended to inspire courage in its defenders. True to Ramesses's character, this temple was dedicated to his own divine cult. For a time, the pharaoh's western wall effectively kept the Libyans at bay. They failed to breach the defensive line during his lifetime. However, after Ramesses's death, the unexpected rise of his 13th son, Amenhotep presented the Libyans with a new opportunity. In 1209, during the 5th year of Amenhotep's reign, word reached the pharaoh. The vile leader of the Libyan enemies, Mary, son of Didi, has advanced. The cunning enemy had prepared well. Forming a web of strategic alliances, he orchestrated a simultaneous uprising in Nubia to divert Egypt's southern forces, while reinforcing his own Libyan army with a sizable contingent of mercenaries from the Aegean and beyond. These sea peoples introduced a completely new form of warfare, relying on heavily armored infantry equipped with short-range weapons, small round shields, and protective body armor. Their tightly packed ranks of well-equipped soldiers rendered Egypt's traditional chariotry virtually useless. Like the Libyans, many of these sea peoples had previously served as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. Indeed, Aegean troops had formed part of Ramesses II's personal guard at Kadesh, giving them valuable knowledge of Egypt's military strengths and weaknesses. Mary's strategy was simple but shrewd: divide and conquer. By launching attacks on multiple fronts at once, he aimed to throw the Egyptians into disarray, disrupt their communication lines, and create an opening for victory. He first dispatched a small raiding force along the coast to keep Egypt's border garrisons preoccupied, while the main army advanced through the western desert oases, Siwa, Bahia, and Farafra. The latter controlled several desert routes connecting to the Nile Valley at various points, allowing Mary to keep the Egyptians guessing about his next move. Once he was certain that the Nubian diversion was underway, he advanced on Egypt in a coordinated pincer movement designed to block any organized counterattack. Leading his primary force from Farafra back to Bahia and then to the Fayum, he entered the Nile Valley near the pyramids of Dashur, moving northward to the outskirts of the western delta. Meanwhile, a secondary detachment split off at Bahariya, crossing the Nile in Middle Egypt to infiltrate the eastern delta, drawing attention away from Ramesses and Memphis. Barely a month after receiving the first reports of the invasion, Pharaoh Merinta mobilized his army and confronted the enemy near Perer. It was midsummer 1208, just as his father Ramesses had faced his greatest trial in the 5th year of his rule. So now Merinta found himself tested in the same year of his own reign. But this time, Egypt would not leave the outcome to chance. If the Libyans and Sea peoples had studied Egyptian tactics, the Egyptians had done the same. Merinta knew that his chariots and archers could not easily break through dense infantry formations head-on. Instead, he lured the enemy forward into his lines, while archers positioned on both flanks unleashed relentless volleys of arrows, sweeping across the advancing soldiers. After 6 brutal hours of slaughter, the Libyan coalition collapsed. At that point, the Egyptian chariots charged, turning a hard-fought victory into a full-scale rout. The fleeing enemy was hunted down, leaving few survivors. The spoils of war were immense. Thousands of metal vessels, livestock, and advanced weaponry fell into Egyptian hands. To further reinforce his triumph and deliver a chilling message to future adversaries, Merinta ordered a horrific display of psychological warfare. The surviving Libyans soon came to envy their fallen comrades at Perer, as they were rounded up and impaled alive on stakes. By the end of the day, rows of fly-ridden corpses lined the main desert road south of Memphis, their entrails rotting in the oppressive heat, visible to any retreating Libyans and to the local population alike. It was a brutal warning, yet even such a savage display could not guarantee Egypt's safety for long. Merinta understood that the Libyans would strike again. He also recognized the constant threat posed by their allies, the Sea peoples, who could arrive unexpectedly from nearly any direction. In response, he devised a broader strategic approach, reinforcing Ugarit, sending shipments of grain to support the Hittites' northern defenses, and even incorporating Hittite infantry into his own army. These foreign soldiers were equipped with their own specialized weaponry, produced in the bronze workshops of Ramesses. The hostilities of Kadesh were now a distant memory. In the unstable new world of the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt needed every ally it could secure. Ironically, the commemorative inscription Merinta ordered to celebrate his second victory over the Libyans is not remembered for its details of the battle or for its accounts of Egypt's defensive efforts. Instead, it is renowned for a single, brief reference in its penultimate line. After routing the Western invaders, Merinta's army marched directly across the delta into Palestine, retaking the crucial cities of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yinom. To further stabilize this critical buffer zone, his forces then attacked and annihilated a previously unrecorded rebel group inhabiting the hill country of Canaan. This group called itself Israel. It is the only mention of Israel in any known ancient Egyptian text and signals the emergence of militarized tribes that, while unable to challenge Egypt in open warfare, nonetheless posed a growing threat to regional stability. In truth, Israel should have been a headline rather than an afterthought. The entire Near East was undergoing profound upheaval. Long-standing powers were weakening, new groups and states were rising, and evolving military tactics were shifting the balance of power. Despite its proud military traditions and its lineage of warrior pharaohs, Egypt now faced a future marked by uncertainty. In an absolute monarchy, a lengthy reign could be both a blessing and a curse. While too many rapid changes on the throne risked undermining the divine authority of kingship and destabilizing the government, an extended rule carried its own perils. Ramesses II's extraordinary 67-year reign brought both benefits and complications to Egypt's administration. On the positive side, his resolve and personal magnetism succeeded in restoring Egypt's status as a dominant imperial power, and the numerous monuments he commissioned stood as symbols of revived confidence and prosperity. On the negative side, Ramesses's remarkable longevity, combined with his prolific offspring, planted the seeds for serious succession disputes in the years that followed. Although Merentia, as the eldest surviving son, inherited the throne without much contest, and his reign remained relatively stable, trouble erupted soon after his death. The passing of Merentia unleashed a flood of royal grandchildren who considered themselves rightful heirs to the throne. Ramesses II had sought to reinstate dynastic stability after the chaos of the post-Akhenaten period by breaking long-standing traditions and granting powerful governmental roles to his many sons. As a result, these sons grew accustomed to holding significant power, with the throne appearing to them as a legitimate prize. Predictably, a fierce succession crisis unfolded following Merentia's death in 1204, as two rival contenders vied for the crown. One was Seti Merentia, Merentia's eldest son and designated heir. Opposing him was Amenhotep, another grandson of Ramesses II. Despite the tradition of primogeniture favoring Seti Merentia, it was Amenhotep who initially gained control. With strong allies in high office, and possibly military backing as well, Amenhotep seized power and ruled for 4 years, while Seti Merentia languished in distant exile within one of the royal residences, powerless within his own kingdom. Yet Amenhotep's grip on power would not last indefinitely. Eventually, the balance shifted, allowing Seti Merentia to reclaim his rightful position as King Seti II. Once restored, he immediately launched a sweeping purge. High-ranking officials who had served under Amenhotep were swiftly stripped of their positions, including the vizier and the high priest of Ammonius. Having supported the wrong side, they paid dearly for their allegiance. The purge spread throughout the government, temporarily crippling the administration as Seti eliminated anyone suspected of sympathizing with his rival. Amenhotep himself received no clemency despite being Seti's first cousin. His name was systematically erased from all monuments and inscriptions. Statues and temple reliefs bearing Amenhotep's name were defaced, with Seti's name carved in their place. Since the preservation of one's name was essential for eternal life, its destruction meant complete obliteration. For an Egyptian, there was no more dreadful fate. Like his father Merentia before him, Seti II was already advanced in age when he ascended to the throne, fully aware that his time to leave a lasting legacy was limited. Eager to make his mark, he set his workforce of quarrymen, masons, and architects into a frenzy of activity, determined to contribute to the sacred landscape of Thebes. On the east bank, at Ipit-Sut, builders began constructing a modest 3-chambered chapel to house the sacred bark shrines of Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu. Although diminutive compared to the grand hypostyle halls of Seti I and Ramesses II, it was still a monument. Across the Nile, the Valley of the Kings bustled with unprecedented urgency. The laborers toiled simultaneously on 3 separate tombs. With no increase in manpower, the relentless pace placed enormous strain on the workforce. The valley echoed constantly with the clatter of chisels and the shouts of exhausted workmen, resulting in craftsmanship that fell well below the standards of previous generations. Seti's race against time was lost after only 2 years on the throne. Like his father and grandfather, he passed into the afterlife to join his royal ancestors. His intended successor, another Seti Merentia, was either deceased or unable to assert his claim. In his place, and with the support of Chancellor Bey, the crown fell to a sickly young prince afflicted with a withered left leg. Though hardly an inspiring figure, the youth was malleable and of royal blood. This new king, Siptah, was in fact the surviving son of Amenhotep, Seti II's former rival. During Seti II's brief rule, Bey had expertly played the role of loyal lieutenant, rising from the position of royal scribe to chancellor. He even earned the rare privilege of a tomb within the royal necropolis. Yet, before Seti II's body was even interred, Bey shifted his allegiance, backing the fragile son of his former enemy. His betrayal was profound. Boasting publicly that he had established the king on his father's seat, Bey's true motivation was self-interest, securing his own power and influence. Because Siptah was still a minor, a regency was formed to govern on his behalf. For appearance's sake, the regency was led by Seti II's widow, Tawisret, but Bey exercised a real authority from behind the scenes. In the 5th year of Siptah's reign, 1193, Tawisret made her move. As Hatshepsut had done centuries earlier, she adopted full royal titles and rallied her allies within the court to overthrow Bey. His fall was swift and absolute. Accused of treason, Bey was executed, and his name was officially erased from records, denying him immortality. Official references to him reduced him to the great enemy, or derisively, the upstart from Syria. The following year, Siptah himself died under convenient circumstances. With her enemies eliminated, Tawisret unleashed a systematic purge of his memory. His names were chiseled out from his tomb and from her own, replaced with those of her deceased husband, Seti II. In this way, the descendants of Merinta ultimately secured their triumph. But this victory came at a steep price. Egypt had endured more than a decade of internal strife among the descendants of Ramesses II. The nation was destabilized by an endless cycle of coups, counter-coups, purges, and reprisals. Governmental functions were paralyzed, leaving the state effectively powerless. No male heir remained to continue the royal line. Instead, the throne was held by a vengeful widow. Less than 20 years after Merenna's resounding triumph at Perer, Egypt had descended into chaos, with responsibility for the nation's decline lying squarely with the ruling dynasty. What Egypt needed was sweeping reform. Egypt had faced such crises before. The turmoil that followed Tutankhamun's death, though now beyond living memory, offered a recent precedent. Then, as now, the solution had been to turn to the military. And so, once more, the power brokers of Thebes and Memphis looked to the army for a leader. The man they chose was perfectly suited, an experienced army commander in charge of the garrison troops, trained for leadership and capable of seizing power. With a son already serving in the military, he also offered the prospect of dynastic continuity. Even his name, Sethnacht, seemed predestined. Sethnacht rose to the occasion. In 1190, he mobilized his forces, crushed all opposition, and restored order within months. His swift military coup left no enemies standing. To reinforce his position, Sethnacht unleashed a propaganda campaign to complement his military success. On a victory stela at Abu, Egypt's traditional southern boundary, he painted a bleak portrait of the nation-state before his intervention. Egypt had been in ruins and had lost its divine favor. He further accused unnamed Egyptian authorities of plotting with Asiatic outsiders to seize control, exploiting Egypt's deep-seated fear and distrust of foreigners. In doing so, Sethnacht cast himself not as a usurper, but as Egypt's savior, divinely chosen above millions, ahead of countless others. Following the example of Horemheb, Sethnacht erased his immediate predecessors from the historical record, presenting himself as the legitimate successor of Seti II. It was a carefully orchestrated manipulation of history. Although already advanced in years, Sethnacht had no need to worry about securing his legacy. His son and heir, fittingly named Ramesses, would ensure the continuity of his line. When Ramesses III ascended the throne in 1187, he deliberately modeled himself after his illustrious predecessor Ramesses II, adopting the same names and royal titles as the victor of Kadesh. He even gave his own sons the same names and roles at court as Ramesses II's children. Construction commenced on a grand mortuary temple at western Thebes, echoing the design of the Ramesseum. For both officials and ordinary Egyptians, it must have felt like a revival. History, however, was about to repeat itself.